Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets comfortable and the past has a habit of leaving strange little clues on the table. Tonight, we're settling in with a map. Not a giant glowing map on a phone that reroutes you the moment you miss a turn, and not the sort folded in a glove compartment with one corner permanently torn and an unreasonable amount of confidence about backroads. This one is older, stranger, and just a little more unsettling. Because every now and then, among the neat lines of history, something appears that does not behave as expected. And in this case, that something is a sheet of parchment from the year 1513 that seems, at least to some eyes, to know more than it should. Before we get into that quiet puzzle, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. What part of the world are you in, and what hour has found you there? Are you listening in the late evening with the lights low and the day finally loosening its grip? Or has this found you in the early morning when everything still feels undecided? It always amazes me a little that a story about old maps can travel so easily across the planet while the people who first drew coastlines had to imagine whole continents from wind, rumour, and whatever survived the voyage home. We arrive here from different places, in different time zones, and yet for a little while we get to sit with the same question. How could a 500-year-old map still make modern people stop and stare? And if you find this kind of thing soothing, or interesting, or simply a pleasant place to let your thoughts slow down for a while, do consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps this quiet corner reach more people who enjoy history, when it behaves a bit like a detective story, and geography when it starts sounding suspiciously like gossip from sailors who may or may not have exaggerated after 3 weeks at sea, which to be fair, most of us would probably do. Now, I should warn you that this is one of those subjects that can make the mind wander in a very specific way. Not in the frantic sense, not in the I have made coffee at the wrong hour and now regret everything sense, but in the slow and steady way that comes from looking at something old and realising it has not finished speaking. A map can do that. We tend to think of maps as practical things, useful things, things that answer questions. Where am I? Where is the river? How far to the coast? Which road gets me there without involving an emotional argument with a roundabout? But old maps are not only practical. They are records of what people believed the world looked like when much of the world was still uncertain. They are part measurement, part memory, part ambition, and part guesswork dressed in excellent penmanship. That alone would make them interesting. But every so often, one comes along that seems to do more than reflect its time. It seems to lean out of it. It seems to suggest that somewhere behind the visible ink, there were older hands, older charts, older routes, and perhaps older knowledge feeding into it. That is why people are still talking about the Piri Reis Map. It survives only in part, which is already a fitting way for a mystery to arrive. Not whole, not complete, just enough to make you curious, just enough to make certainty a little difficult. It was drawn in the early 16th century by an Ottoman admiral and cartographer named Piri Reis, and what remains of it shows parts of the Atlantic world, the western coasts of Europe and Africa, the eastern coast of South America, and a southern landmass that has inspired more debate than perhaps any inked coastline has a right to. At first glance, it is beautiful in the way many early maps are beautiful. It is precise and decorative at once. There are notes, there are ships, there is confidence. The lines do not tremble. Whoever made it did not seem like a man uncertain of his subject, even if the world itself was still only partially known to the people drawing it. And maybe that is one of the reasons it lingers in the imagination. It does not look like a crude attempt. It looks like the work of someone assembling pieces of a much larger puzzle, and trying, with great seriousness, to place them in relation to each other. And perhaps that is the first thing worth noticing. The map was not created in a vacuum. We sometimes talk about historical artifacts as though they arrive out of nowhere, like a magician pulling a rabbit from a hat, only with more parchment and fewer rabbits. But cartographers rarely invented the world from scratch. They collected, they compared, they borrowed from earlier charts, they copied from travellers, they listened to merchants, pilots, soldiers, prisoners, navigators, and anyone else who had seen a coastline closely enough to survive describing it later. A map maker, especially in the age of sail, was part scholar and part editor. He worked with fragments, a harbour here, a cape there, a report that this stretch of coast bends westward, another that a chain of islands lies 3 days beyond a current nobody fully trusts. Then all of it had to be turned into something coherent, which is why the Piri Reis Map raises such an appealing question. What sources was Piri Reis actually using? What older materials sat behind his work? What had been seen, copied, translated, traded, lost, damaged, redrawn, or misunderstood before his pen ever touched the parchment? Because if an early 16th century map looks unexpectedly informed in some places, the answer does not have to be magic, and it does not have to be nonsense either. Sometimes the most interesting possibility is also the most human one. That knowledge moved, that maps copied maps which copied maps, that the world was being stitched together in workshops and ports and courts through a long chain of witnesses, some careful and some probably not. Still, it is one thing to know that old map makers relied on older sources. It is another to encounter a specific map that seems to invite the suspicion that some of those sources are now gone. Lost charts have a particular effect on the imagination. A lost chart is not just a missing document, it is a missing pair of eyes. It means somebody may have known something once, drawn something once, measured something once, and then vanished from the record except for a faint echo in somebody else's work. There is something deeply compelling about that. History often survives in copies, not the original voice, but the trace it left in another hand. And maps are especially good at preserving traces. A chronicler can paraphrase, a storyteller can embellish, a politician can improve the truth until it barely recognises itself. A map does its own kind of interpretation, of course, but it also has limits. If a coastline bends, it bends. If an island is misplaced, it is misplaced. If a headland appears where modern viewers do not expect it, people begin leaning in very close indeed. That is where the fascination begins with the Piri Reis Map, not simply because it is old, but because it seems to sit at the intersection of three irresistible things: exploration, uncertainty, and the unsettling possibility that we do not entirely understand what information early cartographers had access to. That last idea can lead people in very different directions. Some become wonderfully cautious and say, perhaps there were earlier charts now lost to history, and perhaps this map preserves fragments of them. Others become wonderfully enthusiastic in a way history does not always survive intact and say, clearly this proves everything from ancient forgotten civilizations to somebody in the distant past, taking unusually accurate notes from a very high altitude. Human beings do love a mystery, and once one appears, we're all far more willing than we admit to invite some eccentric guest to the party. So tonight, we're going to take the slower route. The better route, I think. We're not here to rush toward the loudest explanation. We're here to sit with the object itself, with the world that produced it, with the habits of early map-making, and with the possibility that the truth may be more layered than either extreme allows. Because old mysteries are rarely improved by shouting at them. They usually respond better to patience, context, and the occasional raised eyebrow. Try for a moment to imagine the world of 1513 as a working reality and not as a distant date in a textbook. Columbus had crossed the Atlantic only a couple of decades earlier. European knowledge of the Americas was still fresh, incomplete, and mixed with confusion. Sea routes mattered enormously. Empires were expanding. Information travelled, but not evenly. A coastline discovered was not instantly known everywhere. A voyage could produce astonishing details and still deliver them imperfectly. A map could include something new and still remain deeply wrong in other places. In fact, that was normal. Accuracy did not spread like electricity. It spread like rumour, attached to cargo. And yet, against that background, here is this map. Here is an Ottoman admiral compiling material from multiple sources and producing an image of the Atlantic world that would later, centuries later, be rediscovered and scrutinized by people already living in an age of satellites, aerial photography, and standardized projection systems. That contrast matters, because part of the map's modern reputation comes not just from what it shows, but from the shock of seeing an old artifact measured against modern expectations. We're used to assuming progress leaves no ambiguity behind. We imagine older maps as necessarily cruder and newer maps as final. But modern maps are not simply better in every philosophical sense. They are better for certain purposes. They are standardized, clean, precise in a way old maps could not be. Yet sometimes, in becoming more precise, maps also become less expressive of uncertainty, less visibly layered, less open about where knowledge came from. An old map can show you not just a coast, but the process by which a coast entered human awareness. It can reveal ambition, assumption, inheritance, and error all in the same sweep of ink. In that sense, modern maps often tell you where things are, while older maps sometimes tell you how people were trying to know where things were, and that difference can be surprisingly important. Because when people say, a 500-year-old map shows something modern maps don't, they may not always mean a lost continent waiting politely to be rediscovered. Sometimes they mean that the old map preserves a confusion, a memory, or a cartographic choice that later mapping cleaned away. That may sound less dramatic than hidden ancient knowledge, but it is not necessarily less mysterious. A vanished coastline on a modern map may not mean the old map was right and the new one wrong. It may mean the old map captured a rumour modern cartography has no use for. Or it may mean an earlier source reflected a coastline seen under different assumptions. Or it may mean several sources were spliced together so cleverly that the result looks almost coherent until you ask one question too many, which fortunately is one of the great pleasures of history. Asking one question too many is half the work. And there is another reason this story has endured. It touches a small nerve in the modern mind. We like to think we're finished with the age of blank spaces. We know the poles, the oceans, the satellite view, the elevation data, the shipping lanes, the roads, the coastlines, and the rest stop where someone has left a review so oddly detailed it could qualify as literature. We live with the assumption that the map is done. The world, at least in geographic terms, has been fully pinned down, and that is mostly true. But then an object like the Piri Reis Map appears in conversation, and reminds us that the history of knowing the world is not a straight line from ignorance to perfect clarity. It is a pile of drafts, a tower of revisions, a long series of approximations, some brilliant, some misleading, some built on sources now missing. That missing part is what gives the whole subject its afterimage. Lost sources are difficult to resist because they create a space into which imagination immediately steps. If Piri Reis used older charts, where did they come from? Were they Portuguese? Arab? Based on Columbus? Based on several traditions meeting on the same parchment? Were some copied from copies of copies? What did each original chart actually look like before it passed through other hands? What was sharpened? What was warped? And what was quietly dropped because a later cartographer did not trust it, understand it, or have room for it? Once you begin asking these questions, the map stops being a static object and becomes a crossroads, and that really is where we begin. Not with a conclusion, not with a grand claim, and certainly not with the sort of certainty that only arrives after history has been thoroughly bullied into agreement. We begin with a surviving fragment made in 1513 by Piri Reis, a naval officer with access to maritime knowledge in a world where coastlines were treasure, rumours mattered, and maps could be assembled from astonishingly varied materials. We begin with the uncomfortable possibility that a map may preserve information, even when we no longer possess the exact chain of sources behind it. We begin with the question of what it means for something to look familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. And we begin, most of all, with that odd feeling that comes from placing a very old artifact beside a modern map and realizing the past has not finished asking its questions yet. So let's move a little closer now. Let's imagine the parchment laid flat before us, the ink settled into its lines, the edges carrying the quiet evidence of survival. Let's leave behind, for just a while, the reflex to either dismiss or exaggerate. Because before this becomes a mystery about hidden knowledge, ancient sources or cartographic puzzles, it begins as something simpler and more intriguing at once. A man in the early 16th century made a map, and on that map are coastlines that still make people wonder what exactly he had in front of him when he drew them. And once that question is on the table, it becomes very hard not to follow it. There is a special kind of unease that comes from looking at an old map and feeling for just a second that it is looking back at you. Not because Parchment has opinions, although some surviving documents do carry themselves with the confidence of a person who has never once doubted a restaurant recommendation, but because a map is never only lines and labels, it is a claim. It is someone somewhere saying, this is what the world looks like, this is where the coast bends, this is where the islands gather, this is where the sea opens, and this is where land rises out of it. And when the map is very old, and some of those claims seem surprisingly informed, the feeling changes. It stops being simple admiration and becomes something a little closer to suspicion. That is the mood surrounding the Piri Reis Map. Not panic, not revelation, not the dramatic music some people seem determined to play any time history does something mildly inconvenient, but suspicion. Quiet suspicion. The kind that begins with a tilt of the head, because the surviving fragment of this map, drawn in 1513, has an odd reputation. It looks, in places, as though it knows too much. Not everything, certainly. No honest person looking at early cartography for more than 5 minutes could maintain the fantasy that the 16th century had somehow solved geography and then simply forgot to mention it. The map contains distortions, uncertainties, decorative elements, and the usual signs of a world still being pieced together from scattered reports. And yet there are portions of it that have made generations of readers wonder whether its maker had access to older materials of unusual quality, or at least to information that was later lost, filtered out, or misunderstood. That is the important distinction. A map does not have to be miraculously accurate to be unsettling. It only has to be accurate in the wrong ways, or in the wrong places, or in ways that seem out of step with what we expect from its era. We modern people are very attached to orderly timelines. We like our discoveries lined up neatly, our progress moving in one direction, and our historical surprises to be charming rather than disruptive. A very old spoon is charming. A very old map that appears to preserve details nobody thought should be there is more difficult. It invites questions, and once those questions begin, they spread quickly. Imagine for a moment that you're not looking at the Piri Reis Map through the lens of documentaries, internet debates, or books with suspiciously dramatic cover art. Imagine you're simply examining it as an object. You see a fragment of a larger work. You see coastlines of the Atlantic world, parts of Europe and Africa, the bulge of South America, islands scattered across the ocean, annotations written beside features, ships and embellishments that remind you this was not merely a technical diagram, but a work made in a culture that still allowed maps to have a bit of personality. It is not lifeless. It is not the sterile view from nowhere that we now call up with a swipe of the thumb. It is a map made by a person for other people, and that alone changes how it feels. Then you begin to notice that it appears to incorporate material from several different traditions. That is not unusual in itself. Cartographers borrowed constantly. Information moved through conquest, trade, diplomacy, theft, hearsay, and the occasional very practical act of one sailor peering over another sailor's shoulder. But when a map begins looking as though it is a collage of sources, the question becomes which sources. That is where the mystery takes shape. Because if Piri Reis was compiling from earlier charts, and he almost certainly was, then the quality of his work depends heavily on what he inherited. An old map that seems clever may simply have had clever grandparents. That may sound less thrilling than hidden ancient wisdom, but it is actually far more interesting. Lost knowledge in history is rarely a single dramatic thing, like a secret vault under a mountain where everybody kept the good coastlines. More often, it's a chain of partial survivals. A chart copied in one port, altered in another, translated badly in a third, damaged by salt water, corrected by someone who had never visited the place in question, and then incorporated into a larger compilation by a mapmaker, doing his best with a pile of contradictory evidence and perhaps a mild headache. When people say the Piri Reis Map seems to know too much, they may really be reacting to the possibility that it preserves traces of exactly that kind of vanished chain. And perhaps this is where we should slow down and ask a simple question. What does it mean exactly for a map to know something? Maps do not think. They do not discover. They do not whisper among themselves after dark, comparing notes on capes and estuaries. A map knows only what has been put into it. But once information enters a map, it acquires a kind of authority. The ink sits there as though it belongs. A guess and an observation can look strangely similar once they are both neatly drawn. This is one of the oldest and most elegant tricks of cartography. Uncertainty, when written carefully enough, begins to look like fact. That matters a great deal here, because some of the fascination around the Piri Reis Map comes from precisely this tension. Certain coastlines appear uncannily suggestive. Some alignments feel almost too good. Certain shapes tempt the eye into recognition. And the eye, it must be said, is a terrible innocent in these matters. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures. Give us enough lines and we will eventually discover a conspiracy, a prophecy, or at the very least a face in the wallpaper. So caution is necessary. But caution does not mean boredom. It does not mean pretending the map is ordinary when it plainly is not. It means staying alert to two possibilities at once. First, that this map may preserve meaningful fragments of earlier geographic knowledge. And second, that modern viewers are extremely good at making old objects flatter our expectations. Still, even with that warning in place, the Piri Reis Map does have a peculiar effect. One reason is that it belongs to a moment in history when the Atlantic was still coming into focus for many of the empires interested in it. The world had not yet settled into the shapes later classrooms would memorize. Coastlines were entering imperial awareness unevenly. Reports from voyages varied in quality. Rival powers guarded navigational information. Knowledge was currency, and like most valuable currencies, it was hoarded, traded, copied, and occasionally mangled beyond recognition. In such a world, an impressive map was not evidence of impossible knowledge. It was evidence of access. Access, however, can be mysterious in its own right. Who had seen what? Which ports handled which charts? Which pilots had talked? Which prisoners had been questioned? Which merchants had quietly passed along information for reasons of profit, prestige, or survival? We tend to imagine history in clean national colours, as though Portuguese data stayed Portuguese, Ottoman data stayed Ottoman, and everyone maintained tidy filing systems labelled highly confidential, do not leave near curious admiral. Real history is much less obedient. Knowledge leaks, it crosses languages, it rides in ships, it survives in memory, it changes hands under pressure, and by the time it reaches a compiler, it may have already lived several lives. That is one reason this map can seem almost unnervingly worldly. It suggests a network behind itself. It implies not a solitary genius inventing coastlines from imagination, but an intelligence assembled out of contact. That does not solve the puzzle, of course. In some ways it deepens it. Because once you accept that the map may rely on earlier sources, you then face the much more specific question of how good those sources were, and where they originated. Were they Iberian Portolan charts? Were some derived from voyages now only dimly recorded? Did they include observations from sailors who had mapped coasts with more care than later narratives preserved? Were they themselves based on still older materials? History is quite capable of being both mundane and astonishing at the same time. There is also the simple matter of appearance. Old maps speak in a different visual language than modern ones. A modern map presents itself as neutral, cleaned of process, flattened into usability. It says, here is the world, efficiently arranged for your convenience. An early modern map is more candid about its humanity. It reveals seams. It shows the joins between confidence and doubt. Decorative flourishes sit beside measurements. Notes crowd the margins. Spaces that are known and spaces that are guessed coexist without the clean, bureaucratic separation modern cartography prefers. And because of that, when something on an old map looks oddly convincing, it feels somehow more intimate than a satellite image. It feels hand-delivered from the past. Suppose, for example, that you found among a relative's papers a sketch of your neighbourhood drawn decades ago. The roads are not all where they are now. A few buildings are missing. A stream that has long since been buried under development appears clearly. The place is both familiar and wrong. You would not call the sketch false just because the present has changed. Nor would you call it supernatural because it records a feature modern maps no longer emphasise. You would understand that it captures a different layer of reality. Now enlarge that sensation to the scale of oceans and continents. Add 500 years. Remove most of the original context, and you begin to understand the strange hold the Piri Reis Map has on people. It may not show a secret world. It may show a remembered one. But that is not quite the whole story, because some of the map's fame comes from claims even stronger than that. Over time, people have pointed to portions of its southern landmass and suggested that it resembles features associated with Antarctica, or with coastlines later interpreted in dramatic ways. This is where the subject tends to leave the company of careful historians and pick up a few enthusiastic hitchhikers, carrying theories large enough to require extra luggage. The problem is not that such claims are automatically foolish. The problem is that they often begin with a conclusion, and then bully the map into compliance. Once a person decides an old chart must contain evidence of a forgotten civilization, an ancient world survey, or knowledge no ordinary sailors could have possessed, every ambiguity on the page starts working overtime. And ambiguity is plentiful. Early maps are full of it. Coastlines can stretch, compress, turn, and merge in ways modern viewers find baffling. Separate regions can be joined, islands can drift, peninsulas can become continental extensions. Distortion is not a flaw added later by conspiracy. It is part of the original condition of the material. A map compiled from multiple sources may contain excellent local detail and poor large-scale alignment at the same time. In fact, that is often exactly what we should expect. A sailor can know one harbour beautifully and still have only a vague sense of how it relates to distant shores. Multiply that by an entire ocean, and you get early modern cartography in a nutshell. So why does the map still feel as if it knows too much? Partly because some of its details appear better than the surrounding uncertainty ought to allow. Partly because we no longer possess every source that fed into it. And partly because there is a psychological thrill in finding the past less ignorant than we had imagined. We are accustomed to thinking of earlier centuries as clumsy apprentices to our polished present. Then an artifact emerges that suggests no, they knew things, not everything, not neatly, not in the form we prefer, but enough to unsettle our confidence. There is also a small vanity wound involved, if we're honest. We like to imagine that modernity has ended surprises of this sort. We have satellites, remote sensing, digital archives, coordinate systems, ocean surveys and maps so detailed they will tell you where to find a sandwich at 2 a.m, though not always whether it is a good idea. We assume that the age of geographical mystery is over. Then a worn parchment from 1513 becomes the centre of debate, and suddenly our confidence seems a little too polished. Not because the map disproves modern cartography, but because it reminds us that the history of knowledge is full of missing paperwork. Missing paperwork has caused an astonishing amount of trouble throughout human history. Kingdoms have argued because of it. Scholars have spent careers chasing it. Families have inherited houses because of it. Entire historical interpretations have wobbled because one person in one archive in one century misplaced something important under a less important pile. With maps, the stakes are even stranger, because the missing item is not only evidence, it is perspective. If one of Piri Reis's source charts has been lost, then what disappeared was not just an object, but a way of seeing the world at a particular moment. That is what gives the map its aftertaste. You finish looking at it and realise the real mystery may not be what is visible, but what once stood behind the visible. Which charts did Piri Reis consult? How old were they? How directly did they descend from voyages in the Atlantic? Were some copied from Portuguese captures or exchanges? Did some preserve coastal knowledge gathered under circumstances we can only partly reconstruct? The more ordinary these questions sound, the more compelling they become, because they point toward a world in which information was fragmented but not absent, scattered but not lost all at once. And perhaps this is the gentlest way to put it. The map seems to know too much because it survives without its full family tree. It presents conclusions without preserving every step of the process. It is like encountering a very confident summary of a conversation after all the speakers have left the room. You can hear the result, but not all the voices, and when that happens, imagination moves in. Sometimes imagination is helpful. Sometimes it starts building Atlantis by Thursday. The trick is to keep it on a short leash. So we stay with the object. We let it be impressive without making it magical. We let it be puzzling without pretending every puzzle is a portal. We notice that it belongs to a period of expanding maritime knowledge, intense rivalry and active compilation. We notice that it may preserve surprisingly good source material in places. We notice that later generations, looking backward through the lens of modern maps, are especially likely to overinterpret what they see. And we keep asking the most useful question of all. Not what impossible thing must have happened, but what ordinary chain of events could produce something that now looks extraordinary. Because history is full of those. A missing source here, a copied chart there, a careful compiler in the right place at the right time, and suddenly 500 years later, a piece of parchment feels as though it is withholding something. Not a secret in the dramatic sense, perhaps, but a context, a set of vanished companions, a record of how knowledge circulated before the world was standardized into the familiar shapes we now trust without thinking. The more one sits with that possibility, the more interesting the map becomes. Not as a solved enigma, but as evidence that old cartography was a far more sophisticated and entangled business than many people assume, and once that much is clear, the next step is almost unavoidable. If this map feels unusually informed, then we need to know more about the man whose name it carries, the world he lived in, and the materials he said he used. Because before the map becomes a battleground of modern interpretation, it begins in a very particular place, in a very particular year, in the hands of a very particular admiral who did not set out to create a mystery for people half a millennium later. He was making a working image of the world as he and his sources understood it, which means that if the map seems to know too much, the first thing we should do is stop staring only at the lines and start asking who, exactly, was holding the pen. To understand a map that later generations would treat almost like an accomplice in some elaborate geographic mystery, it helps to begin with a place rather than a parchment. Not a court, not a library, not a candlelit room where a genius sits frowning at the edge of the known world, but a peninsula, Gallipoli or Gallipoli on the Dardanelles, a town and naval centre in a position so strategic that empires kept returning to it with the same basic thought, which was more or less, yes, this seems important, let's not lose it. Britannica describes Gallipoli as an important Byzantine fortress that became the first Ottoman conquest in Europe and was maintained as a naval base because of its strategic value for the defence of Istanbul. That matters, because if you were going to grow into a person who thought in coastlines, currents, harbours, and sea lanes, this was exactly the sort of place that could train your imagination before anyone ever handed you a chart. Piri Reis was born there around 1470, or perhaps a little earlier, depending on which scholarly estimate you prefer, and the uncertainty is very typical of the period. The past does not always hand over birthdays as neatly as modern bureaucracy does, but the broad outline is clear enough. The man later known to history as Piri Reis was born Muhyiddin Piri in Gallipoli, and he would become an Ottoman admiral, geographer, cartographer, and navigator. The Library of Congress summary of his great navigational work describes him as born in about 1470 in Gallipoli, and later becoming an Ottoman admiral, geographer, and cartographer, while Oxford Reference places his birth about 1465 in Gallipoli, and notes that as a young man he joined his uncle Kemal Reis. So before there was a famous map, there was a boy in a naval town, and before there was a cartographer compiling the Atlantic world, there was a nephew going to sea with an older sailor whose life already belonged to the Mediterranean. That uncle is worth lingering on for a moment, because Kemal Reis was not some decorative relative wheeled in by historians to make the family sound more adventurous. He was a serious maritime figure in his own right, active as a corsair and later an admiral, and Piri seems to have absorbed his education in the old and demanding way by being there, not in a classroom with a globe at the front, but on ships, in weather, among men whose relationship with certainty was much less philosophical than ours. If a modern office job teaches you the skill of answering emails while pretending not to resent them, a life at sea in the late 15th century taught a different set of lessons entirely. You learned what a coast looked like from the water. You learned what harbours felt safe. You learned which winds deserved respect. You learned how quickly rumour travelled between ports, and how often rumour turned out to be the only advance notice anyone was going to get. Oxford Reference notes that the young Piri joined Kemal Reis, and broader historical summaries consistently place him on long years of maritime service under his uncle, before he emerged as a cartographer in his own name. This is one of the details that makes the story more convincing, not less. The Piri Reis Map sometimes gets treated as though it were produced by a mysterious man who appeared from nowhere holding advanced geography like a magician revealing a dove. But Piri was not a detached theorist. He was the opposite. He was soaked in practical seafaring culture. He belonged to a maritime world where information mattered because ships, money, war, and prestige depended on it. And that means the knowledge behind his map did not have to arrive in an impossible way to feel impressive. It could arrive in the very ordinary historical way, which is to say through experience capture, exchange, copying, translation, rivalry, and opportunistic borrowing conducted by people who all believed they were being quite discreet. History is full of discreet people who leave remarkably public results. Gallipoli itself helps explain why this sort of life could produce a map maker. A naval base is not just a place where ships sit about looking purposeful. It is a funnel for information. Men arrive from other coasts. Pilots compare routes. Captains talk. Prisoners are questioned. Merchants complain. Officials demand reports. Charts are corrected, contested, borrowed, and occasionally improved. A strategic port lives by accumulated detail. Which inlet is safe in winter? Which island has fresh water? Which current has embarrassed respectable sailors for 3 generations in a row? If Gallipoli was maintained as a naval base because of its strategic value, as Britannica notes, then it was also one of those places where the sea did not merely pass by. The sea was work, memory, policy, and survival. A person raised in that atmosphere would not have thought of a map as a decorative object. He would have thought of it as something close to compressed experience. By the time we reach the year 1513 then, we are not dealing with a beginner. We are dealing with a man who had spent years in the maritime world, who had sailed with Kemal Reis, who had lived through the rough overlap between corsairing and official service, and who had seen firsthand how naval knowledge was built. The Library of Congress notes that Piri Reis's later book on navigation was originally composed in the 1520s and includes hundreds of maps and portolan charts, which tells us something about the scale of his cartographic ambitions even if that manuscript is later than the world map that concerns us tonight. UNESCO's record for the 1513 world map emphasises that the surviving sheet belongs to a period when positioning recently discovered places was almost technically impossible, and yet Piri managed a considerably accurate coastal depiction of newly discovered regions. That phrasing is very useful because it keeps both halves of the truth in view. The period was difficult, the achievement was real, and 1513 is, in many ways, the perfect date for a map like this to emerge. It sits in a fascinatingly unstable moment. Columbus's Atlantic voyages were still recent enough to feel new. Portuguese exploration along Africa and across the oceans had generated fresh cartographic material. The Americas were not yet a settled mental picture in the wider old world imagination. They were a developing report, a moving target, a compilation in progress. This is very hard for modern minds to feel instinctively, because we have inherited a planet already organised into familiar outlines. Even when we know the history, we tend to imagine that people in the early 16th century were standing only a little behind us, merely waiting for a few final labels to be filled in. They were not. They were working amid a flood of new information that arrived unevenly, often competitively, and rarely in a neat sequence. That is why 1513 matters so much. Had the map been made much earlier, it would not have had access to the recent discoveries that give it part of its reputation. Had it been made much later, some of its surprises would have looked less surprising, because European and Ottoman mapmakers alike were rapidly absorbing new coastal data. But 1513 catches the world in mid-assembly. It preserves a stage when older mapping traditions and new oceanic discoveries were colliding. UNESCO explicitly describes the map as Portolan style, and notes that it bears the signs of a transition from traditional Portolan charts toward more global works. That awkwardness is not a weakness, it is part of the map's fascination. It belongs to a world still trying to fit newly reported lands into inherited habits of representation, which is another way of saying that 1513 was not an afterthought. It was a pressure point. A Portolan chart, by the way, is a wonderfully practical kind of object, even if the name sounds a bit like a meal one ought to order carefully. These charts were built for navigation. They emphasise coastlines, harbours, bearings, compass roses, and rum lines rather than a modern grid of latitude and longitude. UNESCO's documentation of the map points to the wind roses, rum lines, and navigational conventions that align it with Portolan practice. That matters because it reminds us that Piri Reis was not merely illustrating a worldview. He was assembling a navigational image. However decorative the map may appear now in reproduction, its habits are those of sailors. It cares where coasts run, it cares where islands fall, it cares about bearings and maritime relation. And once you remember that, the whole object becomes less mystical and more formidable. This was not a dream of the world. It was an instrument shaped by people who had to survive the world. There is also the matter of sources, and this is where the Admiral becomes especially interesting. Piri Reis did something unusually helpful for future historians, which is that he left notes about how he worked. UNESCO's nomination form states that he listed his sources and explained his methodology in the inscriptions, distinguishing his work from many maps of the same time. The same document notes that according to his own testimony, he consulted 34 old maps, while the widely cited source summary associated with the map describes a mixture of charts, Mappe Mundi, Portuguese material, an Arabic map of India, and a map by Columbus. We should be careful with exact numerical claims because scholars still debate how some of the categories are counted and translated, but the central point is steady. Piri was a compiler. He was not claiming to have discovered every shoreline himself. He was gathering, comparing and integrating multiple streams of knowledge. That is not a lesser achievement. In cartography, it may be the greater one. This also helps explain why an admiral matters to the story in a way a random scribe would not. An admiral, or at least an experienced naval officer moving within maritime networks, had reasons to value current information and opportunities to encounter it. He was closer to pilots, to captured reports, to official interest in coasts and routes, to the practical machinery by which knowledge moved. The famous note that Piri Reis learned details of Columbus's voyages through a captured Spaniard linked to Kemal Reis appears in the map tradition surrounding the work and is echoed in UNESCO's summary of the inscriptions. Whether every detail of that episode can be reconstructed perfectly is less important than the larger pattern it represents. Maritime knowledge in this period did not sit still. It passed through hands, languages and loyalties. A mapmaker with one foot in the world of naval operations and another in the world of compilation occupied an unusually powerful position. He could hear things other people never heard and preserve things other people never bothered to write down properly. Then there is the year itself and the private possibility contained within it. Historical summaries indicate that after Kemal Reis died around 1510 or 1511, Piri returned to Gallipoli and worked on his navigational studies, completing the map dated to Muharram 919 AH, corresponding to 1513. I find that detail especially telling. There is something very human about the possibility that one of the world's most discussed maps emerged during a period of enforced stillness after years at sea. A man loses the uncle with whom he had sailed, returns to his home base, and begins drawing the world from the materials available to him. It is not sentimental to notice that. It is simply worth pausing over. Great compilations often happen when movement stops long enough for memory and paper to finally meet. The sea gives the pieces, shore gives them shape. And then, after the making, comes one of those historical details that feels oddly modest, considering the fame that followed. The map was later presented to Sultan Selim I after the Ottoman conquest of Egypt in 1517, most likely in Cairo, and then it seems to have vanished from active historical attention until its rediscovery in the Topkapi Palace in 1929. That should temper anyone tempted to imagine the map immediately transformed the world. Historical significance and immediate impact are not always the same thing. Some objects become important in their own time, others become important later, when the surviving world finally notices what has been sitting quietly in a library all along. In this case, the surviving fragment became famous not because 16th century observers declared it magical, but because 20th century scholars and readers looked back at it and realised how much was packed into it. There is a lesson in that too. We often assume a mysterious object must have been recognised as mysterious the moment it appeared. But history is full of things that become more interesting as context changes. A map made in 1513 can look one way to a contemporary navigator, another way to a 19th century historian, and another still to a modern audience armed with satellite imagery and an unhealthy appetite for sensational documentaries. Each generation brings its own anxieties and enthusiasms to the Parchment. That is why it is so important to stay with Piri Reis, the person, for a little while longer, before returning to the map as a puzzle. Because once you know that he was a maritime professional from Gallipoli, trained in a naval environment, connected to active seafaring networks, shaped by the practical demands of navigation, and working in a year when the Atlantic world was still being assembled in cartographic memory, the map stops looking like an orphaned miracle. It begins to look like the product of a very specific, very capable, and very well-positioned mind. None of this makes the mystery smaller. In a way, it makes it better. A miracle ends the conversation too quickly. A skilled compiler with access to unusual sources keeps the conversation alive. That version of the story is more generous to history and more respectful to the people who actually made these things. It also leaves room for what is genuinely surprising. Because even after you account for Gallipoli, Kemal Reis, naval intelligence, Portolan methods, and the unstable cartographic world of 1513, one question still remains on the table. What exactly did Piri put on the parchment? What did he choose to include? What shapes did those sources produce? And which parts of the surviving fragment still cause modern eyes to pause a little longer than expected? That is where the matter becomes properly visual. We have the admiral, we have the peninsula, we have the year, balanced in that uneasy moment between old geography and new discovery. The next step is to stop standing beside the man and start leaning over his shoulder. Because before anyone decides whether this map contains lost knowledge, misunderstood coastlines, or simply a few very persuasive accidents, we need to look carefully at what the surviving fragment actually shows. When people first hear about the Piri Reis Map, the conversation usually takes a dramatic turn almost immediately. Someone says it might show Antarctica. Someone else says it proves early sailors knew far more than historians admit. A third person, usually trying to restore a little order, says that old maps were full of guesses and monsters and that everybody should calm down. And somewhere in the middle of all that, the actual object itself gets neglected, which is a pity, because before the map can be mysterious, it has to be seen clearly. Before it can be interpreted, doubted, defended, exaggerated, or recruited into somebody's favourite theory about lost civilizations, it has to be described. What is actually there on the parchment? What survives? What portions of the world are visible? What details belong to the map itself? And what details have been supplied later by our own excited modern imaginations? The first thing to know is that the famous map is not a complete world map in the form we now possess it. Only part of it survives. Roughly 1/3 remains, and that surviving section is kept at Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. UNESCO describes it as a fragment of a Portolan-style world map, while modern summaries of the surviving sheet agree that what we have is the western portion of a larger original work. That matters more than it may seem at first, because any map fragment creates a very specific kind of illusion. A broken thing always tempts the mind to complete it, and once the mind starts completing what is missing, the path from careful history to cheerful overconfidence becomes alarmingly short. What survives is centred not on the entire globe as we would expect from a modern world map, but on the Atlantic world. You're looking at a space where Europe, Africa, and the newly reported Western lands meet across the ocean. The surviving fragment shows the Atlantic Ocean with the western coasts of Europe and Africa and the eastern coast of South America. UNESCO notes that Piri Reis produced a detailed and considerably accurate depiction of the coastlines and islands of newly discovered regions, and the surviving fragment indeed places much of its visual emphasis on shorelines, islands, and maritime relation, rather than on inland detail in the modern sense. This is a sailor's world before it is anyone else's. Coasts matter because coasts can be reached. Islands matter because islands can be missed. The sea is not empty background. It is the stage on which the whole map makes sense. That maritime character is visible in the map structure before you even start following individual coastlines. This is a Portolan-style map, and it behaves like one. UNESCO's nomination materials describe the two major 32-point compass roses, several smaller ones, and the red and black rum line stretching across the surface. Those lines are not decoration in the casual sense. They belong to the navigational logic of the chart. They helped mariners set courses, estimate bearings, and understand directional relation. A modern person opening a map app is used to seeing north quietly assigned to the top of the screen and the planet flattened into patient obedience. The Piri Reis Map does not make the same visual promises. It declares itself as an object of navigation, with wind systems, bearings, and directional geometry laid visibly across its face. It does not hide the method. In that sense, it is far more honest than many modern maps. You can see the machinery of knowing right there in the ink. There are also inscriptions everywhere, which is another reason the map feels more alive than a modern chart. UNESCO notes that the surviving sheet contains extensive notes, primarily in Ottoman Turkish, and that Piri Reis distinguished himself by leaving unusually informative inscriptions about his sources and methods. So when you look at the map, you are not only seeing coasts, you are seeing commentary. The object speaks, it labels, it explains, it describes, it carries in written form a running conversation between visual geography and the knowledge that produced it. That matters because one of the reasons later scholars take the map seriously is not just that it shows things, but that it says things about what it is showing and where those depictions came from. This is not a mute artifact waiting for modern fantasies to animate it. It arrives already annotated by its maker. If you begin on the eastern side of the surviving fragment, toward the familiar Old World shores, the western coasts of Europe and Africa are there in recognisable form, though of course not with the crisp standardization of modern cartography. Atlantic island groups are also present. UNESCO specifically notes the Azores, Canary Islands and Cape Verde Islands as being positioned considerably close to their actual coordinates. That phrase is worth keeping exactly in spirit, because it helps maintain the right scale of admiration. Not perfect, not secretly satellite level, but considerably close, and for 1513 that is a meaningful achievement. The Atlantic Islands are one of the places where the map feels both practical and confident. They anchor the oceanic space between familiar coasts and newer Western reports. For sailors, islands are never trivial. They are stepping stones, warnings, landmarks, opportunities, and sometimes the difference between continuing a voyage and discovering the philosophical depth of dehydration. Then your eye moves westward, and this is where the map begins to show the combination of strength and strangeness that gave it its reputation. South America appears with a coastline that is detailed and impressive for its time. UNESCO calls the depiction of newly discovered coastlines considerably accurate, and broad summaries of the surviving fragment agree that the eastern coast of South America is one of its strongest features. The distance between Brazil and Africa is also noted as roughly correct in scholarly descriptions of the map. This is one of those moments where the artifact earns its fame honestly. You do not have to exaggerate to see why later viewers were impressed. The map's South American coastline is not a random flourish. It reflects serious engagement with current geographical information, especially along the Brazilian coast. But the map is not uniformly modern-looking, and that is exactly why it is so revealing. In the northwest portion of the surviving Atlantic world, the Caribbean does not appear in the neat configuration familiar from later maps. The arrangement is odd, compressed, and in places conceptually tangled. The large island labelled Hispaniola appears in a vertical north-south orientation, which is one of the first features modern viewers tend to notice. Nearby, the western coastline combines elements of Central America and Cuba into a single body of land. Scholars have long connected this distortion to the Colombian worldview, in which Cuba was treated as part of an Asian mainland, and the Piri Reis Map is widely understood to preserve aspects of that confusion rather than cleanly correcting it. This is an enormously important point. The map does not merely preserve coastline, it preserves misunderstanding. It shows not just what people knew, but how they tried to fit new knowledge into older expectations. That is one reason the map is so valuable historically. It is not a final statement. It is a snapshot of geographic thought in motion. Cuba does not yet sit calmly as Cuba. Hispaniola does not yet behave in the clean, spatial way modern atlases demand. The Caribbean appears as a place still passing through the interpretive machinery of Columbus-era assumptions. There are phantom inheritances at work here. Old expectations of Asia pressing against freshly encountered islands. It reminds us that discovery is never just seeing something new. Discovery also involves deciding what the new thing is, and people are often quite bad at that in the early stages. We imagine the first sighting of a coastline as a triumphant moment of fact. In reality, it is usually the beginning of argument, and the map is full of those arguments made visible. The surviving fragment shows the Atlantic and the Americas, but it does not show them as we would. It shows them as assembled through source material of uneven date and uneven confidence. UNESCO emphasises that Piri Reis used numerous source maps and that, according to his own testimony, he consulted 34 older maps. The famous use of Columbus-related material is one of the most cited features of the map's construction. That is why the Caribbean looks the way it does. It is not simply wrong. It is inherited. It is the shape of information passing through another person's era and surviving long enough to be copied into a new and otherwise impressive compilation. A modern map deletes such moments. The Piri Reis Map lets you watch them happen. Then there is the southern portion, and this is where public imagination usually begins vibrating like a kettle left on too long. Along the bottom of the surviving fragment is a large southern landmass. UNESCO notes that the map is among the earliest works showing Terra Australis, and modern scholarly discussion overwhelmingly treats that southern extension as a version of the hypothetical southern continent rather than Antarctica. This is the place where later sensationalism has done the most energetic stretching, because a vague southern land on an early 16th century map invites a certain kind of person to sprint directly toward the nearest frozen theory. But if we stay with what the map actually shows, the picture is more historically grounded and, in its own way, more interesting. It shows a southern land as many maps of the period did, not because Antarctica had been surveyed, but because learned geographic traditions still entertain the idea of a balancing southern continent. This point cannot be stressed too gently. To say the map shows a southern land is not the same as saying it shows Antarctica in any modern sense. The popular Antarctica hypothesis has been widely rejected. The southern continent on the Piri Reis Map belongs much more comfortably within the long history of Terra Australis, the conjectural southern land that appeared in various forms on many maps long before Antarctica was actually charted. Even the more cautious modern descriptions note that the southernmost conclusively identified part of the map is the Brazilian coast down toward the Cananea region, after which the coastline curves sharply east. That sharp turn may reflect source limitations, available parchment space, inherited convention, or the practical habit of forcing difficult coastlines into the surface available. In other words, the map does contain a southern mystery, but not necessarily the one people enjoy putting on documentary thumbnails. The South American section itself also contains names and notes tied to Portuguese voyages. UNESCO specifically points out that no other surviving map provides more information than Piri Reis's inscriptions on Cabral's voyage to Brazil, and that the map played a role in conveying the latest Spanish and Portuguese explorations into the Ottoman world. This means the map is doing something more than simply tracing coasts. It is acting as a channel through which newly gathered Atlantic information is transferred into another imperial and intellectual setting. The coast of Brazil, then, is not just a line on a chart. It is evidence of information moving between worlds. It tells us that what the map shows is not merely geography, it is connection. It is the record of exploration becoming shared knowledge. There is another side to what the map shows, and it is easy to overlook because modern viewers are trained to separate factual mapping from visual embellishment. The Piri Reis Map does not make that separation in the way we do. UNESCO notes illustrations of rulers, fortresses, ships, parrots, animals, and mythological or semi-mythological creatures. Scholarly descriptions of the map also point to the presence of headless men, dog-faced beings, horned beasts, and other figures drawn from older bestiary and mappa mundi traditions. To modern eyes, this can look like evidence that the map is half science, half fantasy, and therefore somehow unreliable. But that would be too simple. In early cartography, accurate coastlines and legendary beings were not always treated as incompatible. They occupied different parts of the same visual universe. A chart could be practical, informed, and still carry inherited symbolic fauna along its margins and interior spaces. That coexistence tells us something important about what we are looking at. The Piri Reis Map is not a modern scientific map interrupted by medieval nonsense. It is an early 16th century cartographic object doing exactly what such objects often did, combining navigational purpose, recent discoveries, inherited learning, visual richness, and cultural symbolism. The creatures do not cancel the coastlines. The coastlines do not erase the creatures. Both belong to a world where mapping was not yet reduced to pure geometrical utility. In a way, this makes the map easier to read historically once you stop demanding that it behave like a 21st century textbook diagram. It is not trying to be your atlas. It is trying to be a richly informed world chart in the language available to its time. Even the treatment of hazards fits that practical and expressive mixture. UNESCO's nomination form, notes that Piri Reis used markings for rocky fields beneath the water, shallow waters, and ledges, integrating conventions he later explained in his book of navigation. This is another reminder that what the map shows is not only broad continental relation. It shows a mariner's concern with danger. Rocks underwater are not philosophical. Shallows are not poetic. A reef can turn a very confident expedition into a case study in regret. So when these signs appear on the chart, they tell us that even amid grand world-making, the map remains tied to the urgent realism of navigation. It is about where the world is, yes, but also about where the ship breaks. The place names matter as well. UNESCO highlights that many Atlantic African locations are rendered with Turkish names, and that the map contributed to the adoption of African and New World place names by Ottoman cultural elites. The same source also notes that some New World place names preserve forms associated with Columbus. So the map is, in a very literal sense, a multilingual document of transmission. It shows what the world looks like when names themselves are travelling. A coastline can cross an ocean in one language and arrive in another. A place can be known, renamed, transliterated, and partially transformed all at once. This is one of the map's quieter strengths. It captures the world not only as space, but as translated information. What it does not show is just as important. It does not show a finished and settled new world. It does not show the Americas in the complete and familiar shape later centuries would standardize. It does not show Antarctica as a clean southern continent waiting for modern recognition. It does not show a globe controlled by longitude and latitude in the modern sense. And it certainly does not show a magical civilization hovering just behind recorded history, tidily solving cartography while leaving everybody else to bumble along for a few hundred years. What it shows is more complicated and more valuable. It shows a world in assembly. It shows a mapmaker handling remarkable source material, inheriting some errors along with some strengths, and producing a chart that is sophisticated precisely because it is transitional. That transitional quality is perhaps the best answer to the question of what the map actually shows. It shows Europe and Africa as inherited Atlantic anchors. It shows island groups placed with notable competence. It shows South America with impressive coastal detail for its era. It shows the Caribbean through the distortions of Colombian geography. It shows a southern land in the long tradition of Terra Australis. It shows compass roses, rum lines, scales, hazards, labels, rulers, ships, animals, legends, and commentary. It shows the latest oceanic discoveries entering Ottoman cartographic understanding through a multilingual, multi-source process. And because it shows all of that at once, it also shows something many modern maps do not. It shows uncertainty without hiding it completely. It shows knowledge before knowledge has finished arranging itself. That is why the map remains so compelling, even when we strip away the louder myths. You do not need Antarctica for this to be interesting. You do not need secret civilizations. You do not need a conspiracy of suppressed cartographers whispering in candlelit basements. All you need is the surviving fragment itself and the willingness to see it as it is. A dense, intelligent, transitional object standing at the edge of a changing world. It is precise in places, inherited in places, distorted in places, and self-explanatory in ways that make it unusually generous to later readers. It does not merely show territory, it shows the process by which territory became legible. And once you have looked at it that way, another question begins to take over. If the map is this mixed, this layered, this visibly built from multiple streams of information, then how much of what we are seeing comes from direct observation, and how much comes from memory, rumour, older charts, and borrowed coastlines passed from hand to hand? Because the next step is not only to admire what is on the parchment, but to ask how such coastlines were assembled in the first place, and why a map can sometimes feel most accurate precisely where it is least original. There is a tendency, when people talk about old maps, to imagine a lone genius staring into the middle distance and somehow producing a coastline through pure brilliance, instinct, and perhaps a dramatic relationship with candlelight. It is a flattering picture, and like many flattering pictures, it is not especially true. Coastlines in the age of sail were usually not drawn from one moment of revelation. They were assembled. They were pieced together from pilot books, copied charts, half-trusted sketches, remembered bearings, captured reports, port gossip, merchant testimony, and whatever else could survive the trip from sea to desk without being ruined by salt, politics, or human vanity. The Piri Reis Map belongs squarely to that world. It is a navigational work built in the Portolan tradition, with compass roses and rhumb lines for laying courses, and Piri Reis himself said he had compiled it from many earlier materials rather than inventing it from scratch. UNESCO's summary of the map notes that he consulted numerous older maps and described his sources and methods in the inscriptions, while Britannica describes Portolan charts as practical navigational charts characterised by rhumb lines used by pilots to lay courses from harbour to harbour. That is where the subject becomes more interesting than the modern myth. Because once you stop asking whether one man in 1513 somehow knew impossible things, you can ask a far better question. What kind of information network could make an early 16th century coastline look unexpectedly informed? And the answer, most of the time, is not hidden technology or forgotten super civilizations politely waiting to be rediscovered in paperback. It is the sea as a carrier of fragments. Sailors did not bring back the truth in neat packages. They brought impressions, distances, names heard from interpreters, sketches of bays, notes on currents, islands glimpsed at bad angles, and stories told after difficult voyages in conditions not especially favourable to calm factual reporting. Yet, if enough of those fragments accumulated in the same commercial and political world, a mapmaker could do something remarkable with them. He could compare them, choose among them, patch them together, and slowly turn rumour into shape. The result might still contain mistakes, but it could also preserve genuine knowledge in places where the paperwork behind that knowledge would later disappear. That is one reason the Piri Reis Map still feels slightly uncanny. It is the visible end of a process whose earlier stages are only partly recoverable. Portolan charts themselves tell you a great deal about how this kind of knowledge was handled. They were not built as abstract world diagrams in the way many medieval maps had been. They were practical tools for moving through coastal space. Britannica notes that they were navigational charts of the European Middle Ages, usually drawn on vellum marked by rhumb lines radiating from compass points, and used by pilots to lay courses from one harbour to another. UNESCO's documentation of the Piri Reis Map adds that its surviving fragment carries the expected Portolan standards, including multiple 32-point compass roses and a network of red and black rhumb lines across the surface. That matters because it means the Piri Reis Map was operating inside a tradition already shaped by mariners' needs. A coastline on such a chart was not there because it looked attractive. It was there because someone needed to move along it, around it, or away from it without making a fatal mistake. Even the map's hazard markings reflect this practical culture. UNESCO notes that Piri Reis used symbols for rocks beneath the water, shallow areas, and ledges, conventions he later explained in his book of navigation. In other words, before the map became a modern mystery, it was part of a working maritime world where coastal knowledge was a survival skill. But practical charts are not the same thing as perfect charts, and that is where memory enters. A sailor's memory is an extraordinary instrument, though not an infallible one. He might remember the angle of approach to a harbour, the shape of a headland at dawn, the position of an island relative to a current, the order in which capes appeared down a coast, and the number of days between one provisioning stop and the next. Yet memory also compresses, exaggerates, rearranges, and translates experience into what can be retold. Anyone who has ever tried to describe a road they know well without the help of a map has discovered how quickly certainty begins to wobble. Now imagine trying to describe a coastline after weeks or months at sea, perhaps in another language, perhaps to a scribe, perhaps while another sailor insists the bay was wider and the cape farther north, and perhaps while somebody in the background is claiming there was definitely an island there because he saw birds and would like that point entered into the official record before lunch. Early cartography was made out of exactly this kind of fragile compression. The remarkable thing is not that old maps contain errors. The remarkable thing is that so many of them contain recognisable coasts at all. Rumour, then, was not the opposite of knowledge. It was often the earliest form in which knowledge travelled. Not reliable enough to stand alone, but too useful to ignore. A merchant hears from a pilot that a coast bends sharply southwest after a certain river mouth. A captured sailor insists that an island chain lies farther west than the official chart shows. A pilot book copied in one port mentions shoals no local authority has charted carefully. A mariner swears that the natives on a newly visited shore named another land beyond sight. None of this counts as settled fact, but none of it vanishes either. It circulates. It gets repeated, softened, sharpened, mistranslated, and finally absorbed into a chart if enough people think it plausible or useful. The Piri Reis Map appears to preserve exactly this sort of layered material. UNESCO notes that Piri's map is built on the latest geographical information available to Turks, Portuguese, Spanish, Italians, and Arabs, and that he explicitly listed and discussed his sources in the inscriptions. So the map is not simply Ottoman in the narrow sense. It is a meeting place. It gathers data that has already crossed frontiers before it reaches the parchment. That is why it can feel older and broader than the hand that drew it. The phrase, older worlds, matters here because maps do not inherit only information. They inherit habits of thought. A coastline copied from an earlier chart may arrive attached to an older idea about what lies beyond it. An island may come with a name from one language and a meaning from another. A newly sighted shore may be fitted into an ancient expectation about the shape of the world. The Piri Reis Map shows this beautifully in the Caribbean. The surviving fragment includes a northwestern arrangement that modern viewers find peculiar. Hispaniola is turned vertically, and the western coastline combines elements of Cuba and Central America into one body of land. Scholars connect that oddness to a lost Colombian source that treated Cuba as part of the Asian mainland and aligned Hispaniola with older ideas about Japan. In other words, the map preserves not just observation but interpretation, and not just interpretation but inherited interpretation from an earlier stage of Atlantic thinking. It is not only showing where land was thought to be, it is showing how new land was being forced into older mental geography. That is one of the most valuable things an old map can do. It lets you see knowledge before it has finished deciding what it means. Piri Reis's own source list is one of the strongest clues to this layered process. According to the map's legend as summarised in modern scholarship, he drew on 20 charts and world maps, 8 Jaffarias or geographies, often linked to the tradition of Ptolemy, an Arabic map of India, 4 newly drawn Portuguese maps, and a map by Columbus, though scholars continue to debate how these categories overlap, and whether the total number of source documents should be counted as 30 or 34. UNESCO's nomination text similarly states that Piri, by his own testimony, consulted 34 old maps, and that the use of a Columbus map was among the most distinctive features of the 1513 work. That list tells us almost everything we need to know about why the map feels so layered. It is not the product of one coherent surveying campaign. It is the child of a family argument. Mediterranean chart traditions, older geographic texts, recent Portuguese discoveries, Arabic materials and Colombian New World knowledge are all trying to occupy the same surface at once. When such materials agree, the result can look impressively clear. When they do not, the map begins to bend under the pressure of incompatible inheritances. That tension between local accuracy and large-scale distortion is one of the defining features of early cartography, and it is exactly what makes the Piri Reis Map such a persuasive object. UNESCO notes that at a time when positioning recently discovered places was almost technically impossible, Piri produced a detailed and considerably accurate depiction of newly discovered coastlines and islands. It also notes that the Azores, Canaries and Cape Verde Islands sit considerably close to their actual coordinates, and that the map reflects European discoveries proficiently. Yet the same surviving fragment contains places that cannot be identified conclusively, phantom islands, inherited misconceptions, and the famous southern landmass that is best understood as a version of Terra Australis rather than Antarctica. So the chart is not uniformly accurate in the modern sense, but neither is it loosely imaginative in every part. It is selective. Some regions are controlled by strong source material, others are governed by old conventions, uncertain reports, or the need to stitch unfinished knowledge into one view. That kind of mixed quality is exactly what you would expect from a compiler working with memory, rumour and earlier worlds all at once. And this is where the modern phrase, lost knowledge, needs to be handled carefully. Sometimes what is lost is not a great secret, but a chain of custody. We no longer possess every chart Piri used. We do not have every intermediate copy. We cannot always identify which report came from direct observation, which came from a copy of a copy, and which was already filtered through another mapmaker's guess. That missing chain creates an illusion of sudden brilliance. A coastline appears on the Piri Reis map, and we ask, how did he know that? The answer may be disappointingly ordinary in the best possible way. He knew because somebody else knew, and because that knowledge survived long enough to be copied into his compilation. Then the earlier object perished, while his version remained. History often works like that. A later copy becomes famous not because it invented the information, but because it accidentally outlived the steps that led to it. There is, however, one more element in the making of coastlines that deserves a little sympathy, and that is the hand of the compiler. Compilation is not passive. A man like Piri Reis was not a shelf. He had to choose. He had to decide which shoreline seemed stronger, which island belonged, which report should be ignored, and how to force mismatched materials into a coherent chart. That can produce oddities, but it can also produce the very features that later generations admire. UNESCO describes the map as a distinguished multicultural union of art and science, built from the latest available information drawn from several traditions. That phrase captures something essential. Piri was not just copying, he was judging. He had to understand enough about the materials in front of him to make them coexist. If the coast of Brazil looks good, that is not only because a Portuguese source may have been good. It is also because Piri had the skill to absorb and represent it effectively within the visual language of his chart. A bad compiler can ruin excellent sources. A capable compiler can preserve them, even while carrying some of their errors forward. There is a small human drama in that. Imagine the table. Imagine the older charts, some recent, some inherited, some perhaps damaged, some copied in unfamiliar script, some carrying names that have shifted in transit, some preserving details of voyages nobody in the room actually sailed. Imagine the problem of scale, the problem of fitting Atlantic and New World information into a surface still shaped by Portolan practice, the temptation to trust a coastline that agrees with another coastline, the irritation of discovering two authorities contradict each other, the very real possibility that a chart from one tradition is more useful in one region, while another chart dominates elsewhere. That is how early maps were born, not in one pure act, but in a sequence of negotiated decisions. When we say a coastline was drawn from memory and rumour, we do not mean it was foolish. We mean it was social. Geography entered maps through people, and people are gloriously inconsistent creatures. It also helps to remember that a map in 1513 was not competing with a satellite image. It was competing with ignorance, distance, secrecy, and time. The miracle, if we must use the word at all, lies not in perfect foresight but in competent assembly. The Piri Reis map shows that by 1513, a skilled Ottoman compiler could draw together recent Iberian discoveries, older geographic traditions, and working navigational conventions into a chart that was both practical and historically revealing. It carried first-hand traces of Columbus's voyages, according to UNESCO, and transmitted current Spanish and Portuguese exploration into the Ottoman world. It also carried older structures of thought that made some regions look familiar to us, and others look strangely misaligned. That combination is the whole point. The chart is not simply modern knowledge arriving early. It is early modern knowledge in the act of becoming. So when you look at the Piri Reis Map and feel that it seems to know too much, part of what you are sensing is not forbidden information but accumulated depth. You're seeing a coastline that may contain several lives beneath its final line. A Portuguese voyage here. A Colombian misconception there. A traditional southern land carried forward from older geography. A remembered harbour. A copied island. A translated place name. A mariner's practical concern with shoals and bearings. A compiler's attempt to make these things fit on one skin of parchment. And because so many of the earlier stages are gone, the surviving result feels more singular than it really was. It feels like a voice when it was actually a chorus. That chorus is what gives the map its authority and its oddness at the same time. It can be right in one region because one stream of information was strong there. It can be wrong in the next because another stream was inherited from an older worldview. It can preserve details modern viewers admire while also carrying forward errors modern viewers find baffling. It can seem advanced and archaic at once because it is both. In that sense, the Piri Reis Map does something modern maps usually hide. It lets you see geography before standardization smoothed out the seams. It lets you see coastlines while the argument behind them is still visible if you know how to look. And that leaves us with the next problem, which is perhaps the most intriguing one of all. If a chart compiled from so many uneven materials can still achieve moments of striking precision, what exactly gives those moments their force? Why do certain islands and coastlines appear so strong, while other regions remain uncertain or visibly inherited from older mistakes? Because once you accept that the map was built from fragments, memory, rumour, and older worlds, the question becomes not whether it is mysterious, but how an incomplete and composite object can sometimes look so unexpectedly sure of itself. There is something especially persuasive about an object that is both incomplete and unexpectedly competent. We are used to fragments behaving modestly. A broken statue should invite sympathy. A torn letter should produce uncertainty. A map missing large portions of itself ought, by instinct, to feel unreliable, or at least apologetic. And yet the Piri Reis Map does not really apologise. It arrives as a surviving piece of a larger whole, and still manages, in places, to look unnervingly sure of what it is doing. That combination is part of what gives it its strange pull. It is not merely old, it is not merely partial, it is partial in a way that still looks informed. That can be difficult for modern minds to process properly, because we tend to confuse completeness with accuracy. We assume the more total a representation is, the more trustworthy it must be. In many situations that makes sense. A map produced from satellites, aerial surveys, geodetic systems, and standard projections has a kind of comprehensive authority an early 16th century chart cannot rival. But authority is not distributed evenly across a map. Even today, different layers of knowledge have different histories behind them. A city street might be measured in absurd detail while an administrative boundary follows an older compromise. A coastline may be exact in one dataset and symbolically simplified in another. Precision, in other words, is often local before it is global, and that is even more true in the world of early cartography. The Piri Reis Map is one of the finest examples of this unevenness surviving in visible form. It contains areas of notable strength and areas of obvious distortion. Certain island groups appear placed with impressive confidence. The eastern coast of South America can look surprisingly well informed for a work dated 1513. The distance between parts of Africa and Brazil feels more plausible than many people expect from an early map. And yet elsewhere, especially in the Caribbean and in the southern extension, the chart begins to fold under inherited errors, interpretive strain, and the practical challenges of compilation. The odd fascination comes from the fact that these two conditions coexist on the same surface. The map is not generally precise in a modern sense. It is selectively precise. It is capable of looking very good in one place and very uncertain in the next. That selective quality is not a flaw to be explained away. It is the whole clue. If the map had been uniformly poor, nobody outside a small circle of specialists would still be discussing it with such enthusiasm. If it had been uniformly excellent, it would provoke a different kind of astonishment altogether, and perhaps deservedly send historians reaching for stronger coffee. But because it is mixed, because it has these pockets of credibility embedded in a larger field of transitional knowledge, it raises exactly the right kind of question. How does a map like this achieve precision where it does? One answer is that incomplete maps can be built from complete local observations. That sounds obvious once stated, but it changes the emotional temperature of the whole subject. A sailor did not need to know the full shape of the planet to map a harbour approach well. A series of navigators could know an island chain thoroughly, without understanding the larger continental arrangement into which that chain belonged. A Portuguese pilot moving repeatedly along the coast of Brazil could accumulate practical coastal knowledge of very high quality in that region, even while broader ideas about the Western world remained unsettled. Then a compiler like Piri Reis could inherit that regional strength and place it into a larger chart whose global coherence was still imperfect. The result would be exactly the sort of object we have here. Locally impressive, globally transitional. That is one reason early nautical charts can surprise modern viewers. They did not always begin with abstract cosmology or with a clean theory of the globe. They often began with use. Where is the coast? Where does it turn? Where are the shoals? Which islands stand where? How many days between one known point and another under expected conditions? Such information accumulates not from grand philosophical clarity, but from repeated encounter. It is procedural before it is theoretical. If enough mariners return through the same waters, local knowledge becomes dense. It can become better, in its way, than the map's overall framework. That may sound strange, but it is a common feature of historical knowledge. People often know the route before they know the system. In fact, one might say that much of human understanding works that way. A village can know every bend of its nearby river, while remaining wildly wrong about what lies beyond the mountains. A shepherd can know the sky with deep practical intimacy, while lacking a formal astronomical model. A family can know exactly how to survive a landscape that imperial administrators later misdescribe on paper. Global understanding often arrives later and carries itself more formally, but local precision has been available to human beings for a very long time. The Piri Reis Map reflects that truth. Its best moments may preserve areas where repeated navigation had already produced a robust body of practical coastal knowledge. There is also the matter of source selection. A mixed map is not only a collection of information, it is a record of editorial decisions. Piri Reis was not required to treat all source material equally. If one chart gave a stronger rendering of a coast than another, he could privilege it. If one region had been explored more actively and charted more recently, its depiction could become better than neighbouring areas still governed by older reports. The map's unevenness therefore tells us something about the strength and freshness of the underlying materials. A patch of surprising precision is often a sign not of impossible knowledge, but of a good source surviving long enough to be copied by a skilled compiler. And compilers matter more than they are usually given credit for. We tend to praise explorers because they are visible in narrative. They sail, land, claim, describe, and return. Cartographers are often treated like secondary figures who merely process what others discovered, but in reality the compiler can be decisive. He decides how to reconcile contradiction. He decides whether an island belongs. He decides how to orient a coast relative to the rest of the chart. He decides when a source seems trustworthy and when it looks suspect. A poor compiler can flatten strong material into confusion. A careful one can preserve its strengths even while working under severe limitations of scale, projection, and inherited habit. The phrase curious precision fits the Piri Reis Map because the precision itself can seem to emerge from conditions that should not guarantee it. The chart is incomplete. Its sources were varied. Some of those sources were already entangled with error. It belongs to a period when positioning newly encountered lands was deeply difficult. And still, there are sections where the coast feels stable, not modern, not exact in the geodetic sense, but stable enough to provoke a second look. That's the kind of thing historians enjoy because it asks to be explained historically rather than romantically. The explanation is not that the map somehow transcended its age. The explanation is that age itself was more knowledgeable, more connected, and more technically capable in certain practical domains than popular imagination often allows. This is one of the gentler corrections that historical objects offer us. They remind us that the past was not waiting passively for us to improve it. It had its own competencies. Some of them were astonishingly refined. Pilots in the age of sail developed habits of observation and memory that modern people, softened by screens and directions spoken by synthetic voices, would struggle to match for even a short journey to the bakery. Maritime knowledge demanded a disciplined eye. You had to read coastlines at a distance, estimate bearings, remember landmarks, interpret weather, and survive without the expectation that the world would continuously update itself for your convenience. It did not. The sea offered very limited customer support. That practical expertise leaves marks on charts. Even where the broader framework remains unstable, repeated encounter can carve confidence into the line. A coastline rendered from active traffic tends to behave differently from one inserted from rumour. You can often feel the difference. The better section seems to know where it is turning. The weaker section merely hopes it turns somewhere useful. On the Piri Reis Map, some of the Atlantic island placements and parts of the South American coast carry that stronger feeling. They suggest not theoretical perfection but accumulated observation. That is often enough to create an impression of sophistication which later viewers, lacking the vanished chain of sources, may overestimate into mystery. Scale plays a role as well. Precision on an early map is sometimes easier to achieve in stretches of coast than in total continental relation. If a navigator or chart tradition knows the sequence of bays, capes and river mouths down a shoreline, that local sequence can be rendered with convincing internal order, even if the larger shape of the continent is still compressed or skewed. Think of someone who knows the rooms of a house beautifully, but draws the exterior footprint all wrong. The internal relationships may still be excellent. Early maps often work like that. Their regional textures can be stronger than their large-scale geometry. This is especially true when longitude remains difficult to handle. Before the development of reliable methods for determining longitude at sea, east-west placement was notoriously troublesome. Latitude could be estimated more effectively through celestial observation, but longitude was a much more stubborn business. That meant coastlines could be traversed and known segment by segment without being fixed in exact global relation, the way modern cartography demands. Again, this helps explain the emotional effect of the Piri Reis Map. Its strongest areas may derive from real and skillful navigation along specific routes, while its overall arrangement remains shaped by the unsolved cartographic problems of its time. To modern eyes that can look contradictory, but historically it is perfectly sensible. There is another subtle reason incomplete maps can feel persuasive. They leave less room to be wrong in ways that expose them immediately. A complete global map invites comprehensive judgment. Every ocean, every continental relation, every projection choice becomes part of the verdict. A fragment centered on the Atlantic world can appear stronger, because it concentrates its authority where its sources were richest. The surviving Piri Reis sheet does not burden itself with the entire planet as later readers imagine it. It gives us a region where maritime networks were actively delivering new information. In other words, part of its precision may come from the fact that it survives exactly where it had the most to work with. That thought is almost mischievous in its implications. We may be judging the map by its best surviving angle. The lost portions, if they were ever available to us, might have complicated the reputation somewhat, or perhaps they would have enriched it. We do not know, but the fragment we possess includes regions of intense navigational interest and recent discovery, areas where source material was fresh, valuable, and politically charged. So the surviving chart is already a kind of concentrated historical solution, the portion most likely to impress because it sits where the information was strongest and the stakes were highest. This does not reduce the achievement. If anything, it sharpens it. To compile high-quality regional knowledge into a coherent visual form at such a moment still required considerable skill. It also required access. Precision is not only a technical matter, it is a social one. Somebody has to know something, somebody has to report it, somebody has to preserve it, and somebody else has to gain access to it. The Piri Reis Map sits at the end of that chain. Its moments of precision are therefore evidence not merely of measurement, but of circulation. They show that practical geographic knowledge had travelled through enough hands and remained legible enough to be turned into ink on parchment in 1513. And that raises a slightly uncomfortable possibility for modern assumptions about progress. We often imagine that once knowledge is gained, it remains available in clean continuity, but that is not always how history behaves. Knowledge can be lost in its specific form even while broader understanding improves. A working chart can vanish while a later tradition absorbs only part of what it contained. A coastline once known through pilot usage can be generalized differently in formal cartography. A local naming tradition can disappear. An interpretive layer can be cleaned away by later standardization. So when people say the Piri Reis Map seems to show something, modern maps do not. One sensible possibility is not that it outperformed modern mapping in absolute accuracy, but that it preserved a particular configuration of inherited coastal knowledge. One later maps had different reasons to represent differently or not at all. Modern maps are designed for clarity, standardization and utility across many contexts. They tend to suppress the visible traces of how their knowledge was assembled. They do not show you the argument, they show you the verdict. An early chart like the Piri Reis Map is less polished in one sense, and more revealing in another. Its incompleteness leaves the process nearer to the surface. Its mixed precision tells you where knowledge was strong, where it was inherited, and where it was being forced into larger conceptual frames not yet fully adequate to the task. That is why the map can feel so educational even when it is not right in the modern sense. It teaches you how geographic confidence is made. There is also, if we are honest, a psychological effect to partial certainty. Total certainty can seem sterile. It closes the door. Partial certainty leaves one open. A map that is completely polished may impress you and then release you. A map that is strong in places and puzzling in others keeps you in the room. It invites comparison, speculation, and close attention. The Piri Reis Map is a master of that. It reassures and unsettles in the same glance. It says, yes, people really did know some of these coasts quite well, and then, almost immediately it says, but not in the way you expected, and not without bringing several older worlds along for the ride. That is what makes its precision curious rather than merely admirable. It does not behave like the precision of a finished system. It behaves like the precision of a world still under construction. It arrives embedded in ambiguity. It is real enough to command respect, incomplete enough to provoke doubt, and uneven enough to force us away from simplistic stories. We cannot dismiss it as fantasy, because some parts are plainly too informed for that. We cannot celebrate it as a lost modernity, because other parts are too visibly transitional. We have to do the harder thing and let it remain a mixed object. And mixed objects are often the most rewarding. They force us to think in gradients. They make room for human skill without pretending human beings were omniscient. They allow for strong local knowledge, imperfect large-scale synthesis, inherited misconceptions, an intelligent compilation all at once. The Piri Reis Map earns its fascination precisely by refusing to sit in a simple category. It is incomplete, but not weak. Precise, but not uniformly so. Old, but not naive. Ambitious, but not detached from practical navigation. Its authority comes not from perfection, but from concentration. Once you begin to see that, another feature of the map starts to stand out more than ever. Because if selective precision can be explained by good local sources and careful compilation, then what are we to make of the large southern shape that curves across the bottom of the surviving fragment? The land that has attracted so much attention, precisely because it seems to sit at the edge between inherited theory and suspiciously suggestive form. That is where the conversation inevitably drifts next, toward the most famous and most argued over part of the map, the land at the bottom of the page. If there is one place on the Piri Reis Map where modern imagination begins to lean forward in its chair, it is the bottom edge. Not the Caribbean, even with all its inherited confusion. Not the Atlantic islands, however nicely placed they seem. Not even the coast of Brazil, impressive as that is for 1513. It is that long southern sweep of land across the lower part of the surviving fragment, the shape that seems to promise more than it quite explains. People look at it and feel at once that they have seen this argument before. Someone points and says, Antarctica. Someone else says, impossible. A third person, with the weary expression of somebody who has attended too many historical debates, says it is probably just an old idea about a southern continent, and that everybody should lower their voices slightly. And in most cases, that third person is much closer to the truth. The southern land on the surviving Piri Reis fragment is generally understood not as Antarctica, but as a version of Terra Australis, the long-imagined southern land that appeared on maps for centuries before Antarctica was actually known. That old southern continent deserves a little sympathy, because it spent a remarkably long time being confidently drawn before reality had the courtesy to cooperate. The idea behind Terra Australis was simple in the way many durable mistakes are simple. Geographers and map makers inherited the belief that the known lands of the northern world ought somehow to be balanced by a substantial landmass in the south. The details changed across time, cultures, and specific maps, but the general habit endured. The Library of Congress notes that from around the 15th century onward, mapmakers were placing Terra Australis on maps, often as an unknown southern land, because the far south remained the emptiest and least known section of the world picture. Britannica likewise describes Terra Australis Incognita as a mythical land conjectured far to the south during the Renaissance. So when the Piri Reis Map shows land at the bottom of the page, it is not doing something isolated or unprecedented. It is participating in a very large cartographic tradition of filling the south with possibility. That point matters because modern viewers often approach the Piri Reis Map as though the southern land must rise or fall on one dramatic question alone. Is it Antarctica, yes or no? But the map does not need to be Antarctica in order to be historically meaningful, and in fact it becomes more intelligible when we stop forcing that question onto it too early. UNESCO, in its description of the map, notes that the surviving fragment is among the earliest works showing Terra Australis. That is already significant. It tells us the southern feature belongs within a known history of conjectural geography, rather than outside it as some impossible intrusion. The map is not hinting at a secret polar survey. It is showing us how a 16th century compiler could integrate new Atlantic discoveries with inherited ideas about what the southern world ought to contain. That is less sensational than hidden Antarctic knowledge, but it is much more revealing about how maps actually worked. Still, it is easy to see why the bottom of the page has such power over people. The line there is broad and assertive. It looks like land. It feels substantial. It seems to continue the habit of coastline already established farther north, and because the fragment itself is incomplete, the eye cannot resist trying to finish what the parchment withholds. We are very poor at leaving a shape unfinished, a broken contour invites completion almost automatically. That is one reason the southern landmass has acquired so much mythology. It arrives exactly where the surviving map becomes hardest to control interpretively. The known coast runs down South America, and then the form turns, stretches, and begins to behave in ways that invite comparison. Once comparison begins, modern viewers start bringing in their own world maps, their own expectations, and their own appetite for the extraordinary. There is, however, a more sober and more interesting way to follow that line. Most scholars do not think the Piri Reis Map shows land south of the Brazilian coast, in the sense required by the Antarctica theory. Modern summaries of the scholarship note that the southernmost conclusively identified portion of the map is a stretch of Brazilian coastline, likely extending to around the Cananea area, after which the coast curves sharply east. One interpretation, associated with cartographic historian Svat Suchek and repeated in modern summaries of the map, is that this turn may reflect South America bent eastward to fit the available parchment, or to reconcile awkward source material. Whether or not that exact explanation accounts for every contour, the larger point stands. The map's southern line does not need to be a separate polar continent at all. It may be partly South America, partly inherited southern continent convention, and partly the visual consequence of forcing imperfect source material into a limited shape. That sort of bending would be entirely in keeping with the map's broader character. The Piri Reis fragment is not a single perspective survey. It is a compilation. It combines strong local material with inherited conceptual geography, and with distortions already present in source maps. We have already seen that in the Caribbean, where Cuba and Central America confuse into one body of land, and Hispaniola takes on an orientation that modern viewers find very strange. If the map can preserve that kind of inherited confusion in one region, there is no reason to imagine that the southern extension must somehow become clean, modern, and uniquely trustworthy, right at the point where evidence is thinnest and convention is strongest. In fact, the opposite is more likely. The lower edge of the map is precisely where one would expect old theories, partial observations, and compositional compromises to gather. The Antarctica claim, by contrast, belongs much more to the 20th century than to the 16th. The version most people know grew famous through writers such as Arlington Schmallery and later Charles Hapgood, who argued that the southern part of the map represented an ice-free Antarctic coast, and therefore preserved extremely ancient knowledge. Modern summaries of the debate are clear that this interpretation is widely rejected. The key problem is not simply that Antarctica was unknown to Piri Reis in any documented historical sense. It is that the argument depends on heavily reworking the map, repositioning it on speculative grids, and then claiming a resemblance to Antarctic features that subsequent analysis has not supported. The Antarctica reading became culturally powerful because it was dramatic, not because the evidence for it was strong. There is another difficulty for the Antarctic theory, and it is one of those wonderfully stubborn little details history occasionally provides when it wants to make a point. The inscriptions associated with the southern coast do not sound Antarctic. Modern discussions of the map note that one of the southern inscriptions describes the land as desolate, associated with large snakes, and said to be very hot, with Portuguese sailors avoiding those shores. However one handles the exact translation, that is not a description that sits comfortably beside an Antarctic reading. One may perhaps argue with a coastline, but a hot land full of large snakes is not the easiest route to the South Pole. Whatever this southern area was meant to represent, the textual material tied to it does not support the fantasy of a carefully observed frozen continent hiding beneath the ice. That does not mean the southern land is unimportant. Quite the opposite. It means it is important in the way old maps are often most useful, not as proof of impossible knowledge, but as evidence of how uncertain knowledge was visualized. The bottom of the page shows us a world not yet cleaned up by later cartographic discipline. It preserves the moment when a compiler could place a newly reported Atlantic and American geography alongside an inherited expectation that some substantial land existed farther south. The southern land is therefore not a mistake in the trivial sense. It is a conceptual placeholder with a history. It belongs to a cartographic mindset in which the unknown was not left blank if a plausible tradition already existed to occupy it. Blankness, after all, can be harder for mapmakers to tolerate than error. A blank edge admits ignorance too openly. A conjectural continent at least has the manners to look organised. There is also something revealing in the way later audiences have reacted to this feature. The bottom of the page became famous not because 16th century readers declared it a wondrous anticipation of Antarctica, but because modern readers, equipped with later maps and accustomed to standardized coastlines, began matching shapes. That is an understandable instinct. We all do it. Give us an outline and we look for the nearest familiar object. But the practice can be misleading, especially with early cartography. If a line is stretched, turned, compressed, or inherited from multiple sources, it may resemble several later coastlines depending on how hard one is willing to squint. Shape comparison alone is a dangerous guide to meaning. It can tell us that something looks suggestive, but not that it was intended as the thing we now think it resembles. And maps, perhaps more than most artifacts, are very vulnerable to being bullied by later viewers into resembling what those viewers already want to find. This becomes even clearer when one remembers how common southern continents were in early modern mapping more generally. The Library of Congress points out that Terra Australis appeared on maps from the 15th century onward, often explicitly marked as unknown or not yet known. In other words, the presence of a southern landmass on the Piri Reis Map is not the astonishing part. The astonishing part is that modern people keep treating this very familiar cartographic habit as though it had appeared from nowhere. The Piri Reis Map is unusual in many ways, but on this point it is participating in a broader language. It is one voice in a long conversation about what might occupy the south before the south was actually surveyed. Seen that way, the land at the bottom of the page stops being an intrusion and becomes a witness. It testifies to an old geographic expectation that remained persuasive for centuries. And yet, to be fair to the map's admirers, there is something about the southern line that keeps the conversation alive even after the grandest claims are set aside. It is not just that the feature exists, it is that it exists on a map that elsewhere contains real, sometimes surprisingly strong recent information about Atlantic islands and the eastern coast of South America. The chart's competence in some regions lends emotional weight to its ambiguities in others. If the coast of Brazil can look this good, people think, perhaps the southern land deserves more credit too. That instinct is not irrational. It is simply incomplete. Good source material in one area does not automatically validate conjecture in another. A map can be excellent along one coast and speculative just below it. In fact, that mixed quality is one of the defining characteristics of early modern cartography. The Piri Reis Map is persuasive precisely because it combines current maritime intelligence with older inherited frameworks. Its southern land belongs to that mixture. There is another layer here, one that modern maps often hide from us. The lower edge of the parchment is not merely a geographical statement, it is also a compositional problem. The surviving fragment is drawn on animal skin, with all the practical irregularities that implies. A coastline on such a surface is not only a measured line, it is an act of fitting. If the source material was already awkward or incomplete, the challenge of accommodating it on the available skin could itself shape the result. That possibility has been raised in discussions of the map's southern curve, and even if one does not reduce the whole matter to parchment geometry, it remains a useful reminder. Cartography is physical. A map is not just an idea. It is something drawn by a hand on a material surface with edges, curvature, and limits. Sometimes the bottom of the page looks the way it does because the page is there. The old Antarctica theory also has a habit of sounding more precise than it actually is. It often speaks as though the map represents an ice-free coastline of Queen Maud Land or some comparably specific Antarctic feature. But those claims depend on modern reconstruction rather than on anything the map explicitly says. More importantly, subsequent studies have not supported the alleged close fit to Antarctic subglacial topography, and the whole argument rests on a chain of assumptions far more elaborate than the map itself requires. The conservative historical reading is much stronger. A 16th century world map includes a southern land because southern lands were commonly imagined, and the lower coast may combine southern Brazil, speculative extension, and inherited Terra Australis logic. This explanation has the enormous advantage of fitting both the period and the document, without asking the parchment to perform miracles. What I find most telling is that the bottom of the page reveals the difference between mystery and misdirection. The mystery is real. Why did the southern coastline take this form? Which sources were strongest there? How much of the line reflects actual reports? How much inherited theory? And how much visual compromise? Those are excellent questions. Misdirection begins when the map is pushed to answer a different question, one it was never built to answer. Did some ancient civilization chart Antarctica and pass the knowledge secretly across the ages? That leap tells us much more about modern appetites than about Ottoman cartography. The quieter historical puzzle is richer. We have a map maker at a moment of expanding Atlantic knowledge who still lives inside older global assumptions. We have a southern edge where real discovery and theoretical geography overlap. We have a parchment that preserves uncertainty in the act of being organised. That is already more than enough to keep us occupied. It is worth noting too that the map's southern feature is not isolated from the rest of its visual language. The surviving fragment includes not only coastlines but animals, creatures, notes and symbols inherited from older map-making traditions. That should remind us that the chart is not trying to separate empirical navigation from imaginative geography in the strict modern way. It can place navigationally useful coastlines beside legendary fauna and inherited continental expectations without feeling any contradiction. The southern land at the bottom of the page therefore belongs to a world where the edge of knowledge is allowed to be visually populated. It is neither blank modern minimalism nor pure fantasy. It is transitional cartography, and transitional cartography is often at its most revealing precisely where later viewers most want it to be definitive. So the land at the bottom of the page is not a solved riddle, but it is not an impossible one either. It is most likely a southern continent in the old cartographic sense, shaped by a mixture of inherited expectation and the lower reaches of Atlantic American source material. It may absorb the tale of South America more than some modern viewers realise. It may curve east because of source distortion, compilation choices, or the demands of the skin on which it was drawn. It is famous because it sits at the point where a strong map becomes most vulnerable to projection from later centuries. And it remains compelling because the line is just convincing enough to keep people talking, and just uncertain enough to prevent the conversation from settling down entirely. Once you accept that, the southern land starts doing something even more valuable than provoking argument. It points backward. It makes you ask not what secret continent was hidden there, but what sources, traditions and lost materials were available to a compiler like Piri Reis when he drew that edge of the world. Because the bottom of the page is really a signpost toward a larger absence. Not a missing Antarctica, but missing charts, missing copies, missing libraries of coastal knowledge, some literal, some dispersed among sailors and ports and archives that no longer exist in full. And once the eye has rested long enough on that southern sweep of land, it becomes very hard not to start wondering about all the documents behind the document, the older worlds behind the older world, and the maps that vanished while this one survived. The phrase, lost charts, burned libraries, forgotten navigators, sounds dramatic enough that one can almost hear a documentary narrator lowering his voice over a shot of candlelight and smoke. And to be fair, history has supplied plenty of smoke. Libraries have burned, archives have been looted, courts have fallen, port cities have changed hands, manuscripts have vanished into private collections, damp storerooms, ship chests, war booty, and the particularly merciless category known as things nobody thought to label properly. But with the Piri Reis Map, the loss is both grander and more ordinary than people sometimes imagine. The mystery is not that one magnificent secret atlas was destroyed in a single cinematic night and left the world forever poorer, though I admit the mind does enjoy that version. The mystery is that cartographic knowledge in the age of sail was scattered across many working objects, many ports, many languages, and many hands. Portolan charts were practical navigational tools, usually drawn on vellum and marked with rum lines for laying courses from harbour to harbour, and while around 130 portolan survive today, they were once part of a much larger working culture. By the 16th century, printed charts and large paper sheets were beginning to replace manuscript portolans, which means that older working charts did not merely risk destruction, they risked obsolescence as well. A world of maps can disappear not only in fire but in revision. That is one reason the Piri Reis Map feels so haunted by absences. Piri Reis did not claim to have invented his world from nowhere. He said in effect that he had built it from earlier materials. Modern summaries of the map's inscriptions report that he consulted a large number of older charts and world maps, including Portuguese sources, an Arabic map of India, and a map associated with Columbus. UNESCO's description of the map stresses that Piri Reis was unusually explicit about his sources and methods, which is enormously helpful because it lets us see the chart not as an isolated act of genius, but as the visible survivor of a larger documentary ecosystem. And that ecosystem is now mostly gone. What survives is the compilation. What does not survive, in most cases, is the full shelf behind it. The chart is therefore valuable not only for what it shows directly, but because it preserves traces of maps no longer extant in their own form. It is one of history's recurring little ironies that later copies sometimes outlive the very sources that made them possible. The lost Columbus connection is the clearest example of that effect. One reason the Piri Reis Map caused such excitement after its rediscovery is that scholars believed it preserved part of an otherwise lost Colombian cartographic tradition. Modern descriptions of the map consistently note that the peculiar Caribbean section likely reflects a lost map drawn by Columbus or under his supervision, carrying forward his mistaken belief that Cuba formed part of the Asian mainland and his inherited confusion about the Western Islands. Whether one reconstructs every step of that chain exactly the same way, the larger point remains. A document can survive inside another document long after the original is gone. That is what makes old maps so eerie in the best sense. They can contain ghosts with edges. A lost chart does not always vanish completely. Sometimes it remains as a bend in a later coastline, an odd placement of an island, a copied place name, or a confidence that now looks strangely detached from the material record behind it. The Piri Reis Map feels richer than its parchment because it is carrying earlier eyes inside its lines. And then there is the map's own survival story, which is almost indecently well suited to the mood of the thing. Only about a third of the original 1513 map survives. Piri Reis later presented it to Sultan Selim I after the Ottoman conquest of Egypt in 1517, and then it effectively slipped out of historical visibility for centuries. It was rediscovered only in 1929 during work connected to the conversion of Topkapi Palace into a museum, when scholars examining the palace collections came upon the parchment and recognised what it was. That sequence should make anyone slightly more humble about the word lost. Lost does not always mean annihilated. Sometimes it means uncatalogued, neglected, misfiled, folded into a bundle nobody has opened in generations, or sleeping quietly in a library that has changed its purpose while the world outside forgets what it holds. In that sense, libraries are not only places where knowledge is preserved, they're also places where knowledge can become invisible without actually disappearing. The Piri Reis Map itself passed through exactly that condition. It was not burned. It was not celebrated continuously either. It simply went quiet until the 20th century learned to listen again. This is where the titles "burned libraries" needs to be handled with care. Fire did destroy collections across history, of course, but for maritime knowledge, another danger was simply use. Portalans and pilot books were in demand because trade and shipping needed them, and the whole Portalan tradition was fed by repeated revisions and new surveys, by compass as pilots and captains added information over time. That is one of the reasons these objects were so valuable and so vulnerable at once. A chart used by navigators was not a ceremonial relic. It was a working thing in a world of weather, handling, copying and replacement. Britannica notes that the first Portolans were hand-drawn and expensive, that they were repeatedly revised, and that manuscript charts were eventually replaced by printed ones as line engraving, and paper made mass production easier. A map does not have to burn to vanish from history. It can simply be copied until the copy becomes preferable, or superseded until the old working surface no longer seems worth preserving. In a practical culture, usefulness can be almost as dangerous to survival as war. There is also a quieter reason navigational knowledge disappears, and that is that navigators themselves are not always remembered with the dignity later centuries reserve for explorers whose names made it into state narratives. The sea was full of pilots, helmsmen, local informants, interpreters, and captains whose observations entered charts without guaranteeing them immortality. Portalan mapping, as Britannica explains, depended on information gathered from pilots and captains, and repeatedly revised into better coastal representation. In other words, the mapmaker's line often rests on the labour of people whose names have not survived beside it. We remember the admiral. We sometimes remember the sovereign who received the chart. We occasionally remember the scholar who rediscovered it in a palace archive. But the working navigators behind individual bays, promontories and hazards can vanish almost completely. Their memory survives only in the accuracy of a turn, the placement of an island, the confidence of a harbour mouth. Forgotten navigators are not a romantic embellishment to this story. They are one of its basic conditions. The map is full of other people's competence. That is what makes the Piri Reis Map such a compelling witness to lost worlds of paper. It sits at the intersection of several traditions that do not all survive equally well. Mediterranean Portolan practice, Arabic and Islamic geographic inheritance, Portuguese exploratory charts, Colombian Atlantic material, and the Ottoman ability to gather and repurpose these into a new synthesis. UNESCO explicitly emphasises that the map transmitted the latest Spanish and Portuguese discoveries into the Ottoman world, and that Piri Reis drew on information available across several cultures. A chart like that is not only a map, it is an archive of circulation. And once you understand that, the losses behind it begin to matter more than ever. Any one of those source streams could thin out. A court library could be dispersed. A pilot book could be recopied without its original annotations. A captured chart could vanish after serving its immediate purpose. A language barrier could sever later readers from what earlier users handled easily. The surviving map is therefore not just a survival. It is a compression of survivals, a place where several endangered lines of knowledge happened to meet before many of them faded. And perhaps that is the best way to think about lost charts and burned libraries in this story. Not as one grand catastrophe, but as a slow thinning of context. We still have the Piri Reis fragment. We do not have the full room it once stood in. We can still see the Atlantic islands, the coast of Brazil, the inherited distortions of the Caribbean, the southern land at the bottom of the page, but the precise documentary family around those features is mostly gone. What were the 30 or so source materials exactly? Which ones were copies? Which were already old? Which were based on direct observation? Which preserved rumour? Which were excellent in one region and dreadful in the next? Those questions are hard to answer because the map has outlived the complete archive that made it legible to its own age. The result is one of the most human kinds of mystery. We are not looking at the impossible. We are looking at survival after thinning. A fragment remains, and around it stretches the invisible outline of things once known well enough to be drawn, and then not preserved well enough to stay. That is also why modern certainty can feel so slightly inadequate beside an artifact like this. We have far better maps now in every practical sense that matters for navigation, measurement and standardization, but we do not necessarily have the same texture of visible inheritance. Modern maps rarely show us the chain of memory behind a line. They do not tell us which forgotten pilot first recognised a harbour entrance clearly enough to pass it on, or which copyist carried a coastline across languages, or which library shelf once held the now-lost chart that fed a better-known compilation. The Piri Reis Map still does. Not because it names every absent person, but because it exposes how much a map can depend on people and papers no longer present. It shows us geography with the missing scaffolding still faintly visible, and once that idea settles in, another question begins to rise almost automatically. If so much of the map's power comes from source material that no longer survives in full, then what exactly are we seeing when we call it precise? Are we seeing the original world more clearly, or are we seeing a very skillful arrangement of fragments that later maps chose to simplify, correct, or leave behind? Because the next step is not only to mourn what vanished, it is to ask what modern mapping no longer tries to preserve at all. One of the quiet misunderstandings behind the whole Piri Reis discussion is the idea that if an old map seems to show something modern maps do not, then modern maps must somehow have failed. But that is not really how maps work. Maps do not simply become better in one straight line until they contain everything anyone could possibly want. They become better at particular tasks. They become more standardized, more specialized, more measurable, more compatible with other systems, and more reliable for the purposes their makers care about. In that process, they also stop trying to preserve certain other things. A modern map is often less a picture of the world in all its inherited complexity than a carefully designed answer to a specific practical question. What road goes where? What coastline is official? What depth is navigationally safe? What administrative boundary is current? What projection best serves this use? Britannica's overview of modern mapmaking notes that map design begins with user requirements and the resulting decisions about content, detail, scale, standards of treatment and symbolization. While Noah explains that modern nautical charts are tailored specifically to marine navigation and are designed to show water depths, shoreline, landmarks, aids to navigation, and other navigationally relevant information. That sounds obvious enough, but it changes the whole conversation. A 16th century chart like the Piri Reis Map was allowed to be many things at once. It could be navigational, political, inherited, decorative, explanatory, speculative, and multilingual on the same surface. A modern official map is usually not trying to do that. It is trying to be legible, interoperable, and fit for purpose. Britannica notes that modern mapmaking requires deliberate generalization, including the omission of some details on smaller scale maps, and NOAA's charting pages emphasise that official electronic chart suites are organised systematically into standardised chart footprints for efficient navigation and updating. In other words, modern maps often gain precision by shedding texture. They do not merely know more, they decide more aggressively what not to show. That is the first thing modern maps no longer try to show, the argument behind the line. When you open a modern map, whether on paper or on a screen, the line of the coast tends to appear as a settled fact. It does not usually tell you which survey superseded which earlier survey, which local naming tradition lost out to an official standard, which copyist once placed an island differently, or which mariners disagreed about the exact shape of a harbour mouth before hydrographic work fixed the issue more firmly. The line arrives already adjudicated. By contrast, an early chart like the Piri Reis Map often leaves the seams visible. It carries inherited confusions beside stronger recent observations. Britannica notes that maps can be original, derived from earlier maps, or a combination of both, but modern map products typically explain such derivation in controlled metadata or footnotes, rather than embedding the historical tension visibly in the image itself. What older maps show on the surface, modern maps often move into the background of documentation. They also no longer try to show uncertainty in the same human way. That does not mean modern cartography has no concept of uncertainty. On the contrary, contemporary mapping and GIS can be extremely rigorous about data quality, positional accuracy and metadata. But those are usually handled through technical standards, confidence measures, update cycles, and layered data sets, not through visibly transitional coastlines or contradictory geographic inheritances. Britannica's survey of 18th century to modern cartography notes that decorative monsters and swash lines disappeared as maps became more factual, while explanatory notes and reliability judgments moved into a more systematic scientific style. The map's face became cleaner, more disciplined, and less willing to display uncertainty as part of its personality. A modern map would generally rather leave a feature out than portray it in an openly conjectural way that invites misreading. That is a major difference from maps like Piri Reis's. On the old chart, uncertainty is not absent, but it is still visible as geography in motion. The Caribbean can carry Colombian misunderstandings. The South can host a version of Terra Australis. Place names can preserve translation across cultures. Islands can stand where knowledge has not yet settled. Modern maps are not built to let you watch that process happen. They aim to hide the wobble. They want the user to be able to trust the product without pausing to ask which part of this shoreline was inherited from one tradition and which from another. In a navigation system, that is a virtue. In a historical artifact, it can feel like a loss. The old map still remembers what it felt like for the world to be under construction. The modern map prefers to hand you the finished surface. Modern maps also no longer try to show the world as a memory object in quite the same way. Portolan charts emerge from a navigational culture built around pilots, compass bearings, repeated coastal travel, and accumulated working knowledge. The Library of Congress describes early Portolan charts as coastal charts, drawn on animal skin that guided mariners, while Britannica notes that these charts were practical tools marked by rum lines, used to lay courses from harbour to harbour. That tradition made the coastline feel less like an abstract boundary and more like a remembered sequence of encounters. A cape was not just a point on a projection. It was something seen from the deck in certain light, under certain weather, after certain currents. Modern official maps still preserve the result of observation, of course, but they are far less interested in preserving the felt pathway by which observation became communal memory. The same is true of naming. Older maps often reveal names in transit. A place might carry a form borrowed from one language, filtered through another, and copied by a mapmaker working in a third. That can make an old chart feel like a record of geographic conversation, rather than a settled lexical system. Modern maps, especially official ones, tend to standardize names more strictly, because consistency is essential for governance, navigation, emergency response, and data integration. NOAA's nautical cartography material shows how charts are compiled as official products designed for use in navigational systems, where ambiguity is a hazard rather than a historical charm. So modern maps generally stop trying to preserve the multilingual drift that can make older charts feel alive with contact. They privilege consistency over the visible record of transmission. Then there is the question of projection, which is one of those subjects that sounds dry until you realise it is quietly rearranging the world every time you look at a flat map. A globe is curved, a map is flat. The problem cannot be solved without compromise. National Geographic's projection materials explain that flattening a spherical Earth onto a flat surface necessarily introduces distortion, and Britannica notes that different projections are chosen to preserve different desired properties such as area or local shape. This means every modern world map is making a disciplined trade-off. Shape, area, distance, and direction cannot all remain perfectly accurate at once over a large extent. A projection is therefore not simply a neutral container for reality. It is a design choice about which distortions are acceptable for a particular use. Old maps were no strangers to distortion, of course, but they often wore it differently. A Portolan chart might preserve coastal relation usefully, without pretending to offer a mathematically uniform world view in the modern sense. A modern map, by contrast, usually tries to manage distortion systematically, so users can trust the product for its intended purpose. National Geographic notes that different projections are selected to emphasise different properties, and that some are most accurate in particular regions or at certain centres. So when we compare an old map to a modern one, we're not comparing truth to error in a simple way. We're comparing two very different philosophies of compromise. One may preserve the lived sequence of a coastline more vividly. The other may provide a standardised spatial framework better suited to global consistency. What modern maps no longer try to show is that older, messier coexistence of practical route memory and conceptual uncertainty. They also no longer try to show decoration as part of epistemology. That may sound like an overly academic sentence, but the idea is simple. On a map like the Piri Reis fragment, ships, rulers, inscriptions, animals and inherited creatures do not merely decorate empty space. They participate in how the world is being presented. They signal authority, danger, strangeness, ownership, story, and inherited learning. By the 18th century, as Britannica notes, the interiors of maps became increasingly factual and decorative figures largely retreated to borders and cartouches before receding further still. Modern maps, especially official and digital ones, are not trying to persuade through visual richness in that older way. They're trying to reduce visual noise, separate layers cleanly, and optimize reading. A lion in a blank region may once have served as a sign of uncertainty, empire, warning, or symbolic presence. A modern chart designer would likely call it distraction and remove it before lunch. Another thing modern maps no longer try to show is the coexistence of the practical and the speculative on one sheet. In the old cartographic world, a map could contain useful coastal detail and conjectural continental ideas together. It could be very good where ships had gone repeatedly and deeply uncertain where theory rushed ahead of observation. The Piri Reis Map's southern land is a perfect example of this, combining strong Atlantic source material nearby with a more inherited southern continent logic. Modern official mapping culture tends not to work that way. It separates product types and levels of confidence. NOAA charts, for instance, focus on navigationally relevant data such as water depths, shoreline, aids to navigation, and other marine information. They are not interested in preserving speculative continental balances from inherited cosmology, however charmingly those might sit at the bottom of a parchment. Modern maps specialise. Older maps often accumulated. This specialisation means that many functions once held together now live apart. The route planning function goes to one map, the historical layer to another, the naming archive to a gazetteer, the legal boundary to an administrative database, the seabed hazard to a nautical chart, the terrain model to digital elevation data, the social memory of a place to oral history, local records, or ethnography. The Library of Congress has described modern map work increasingly in terms of geospatial data and GIS analysis rather than the old flat paper ideal, emphasising that current cartographic practice often means acquiring, manipulating, and analysing digital geospatial data to produce visualizations. That is powerful, but it also means the single map as a dense cultural object has been partly replaced by a system of layers. What modern maps often no longer try to do is hold all those worlds visibly together in one image. This is why digital mapping, for all its extraordinary utility, can sometimes feel strangely bloodless beside an early chart. A digital map is astonishingly good at retrieval. It is excellent at search, routing, zoom, overlay, and update. It is not especially interested in showing the sediment of knowledge. It does not usually reveal that a coastline was once a rumour, that a port name travelled through conquest, that an island shifted its place on maps for a century, or that a navigator's lived familiarity with a shore once mattered more than its mathematically ideal projection. The data may exist somewhere in linked systems, but the everyday map interface does not foreground it. The user is not there to witness cartographic history. The user is there to get somewhere, without taking the scenic route by accident. An honourable goal, certainly, but one that leaves very little room for visible inheritance. Modern maps also no longer try to show rival realities at once. By rival realities, I mean the way older charts could preserve conflicting understandings in a single visual field. A coast could be recent and reliable in one section, inherited and wrong in another. A place name could be current for one audience and archaic for another. The map carried contradiction, because the world being mapped was still unresolved in the mapmaker's sources. Modern cartography generally treats contradiction as a problem to be resolved upstream. Standards, official surveys, and controlled update pipelines exist precisely so the published product does not ask the end user to sort through competing geographic claims unaided. Britannica's discussion of modern map design underscores the importance of standards of treatment and symbolization, which reflects this very impulse toward consistency. The modern map wants to stop the argument before you see it. There is a cost to that, even if it is a cost most of us gladly pay in ordinary life. The old map can reveal not just where the world was thought to be, but how difficult it was to decide. The modern map often reveals only the decision. That makes it more useful and less confessional. It is a little like the difference between reading a final legal ruling and reading the drafts, disputes, and annotations that led there. One is better if you need to act. The other is better if you want to understand how certainty was built. The Piri Reis Map fascinates because it still contains some of that draft-like quality. Modern maps usually erase it by design. Even blank space has changed its meaning. On many old maps, blankness was unstable. It invited notes, creatures, hypotheses, balances, royal claims, and inherited cosmologies. It was an active emptiness that mapmakers often felt compelled to populate. In modern cartography, blank space is more likely to be functional. It may indicate scale choice, omitted data, or a deliberate design decision not to clutter the product. Generalization, as Britannica notes, is not a failure, but a studied judgment about what to omit at a given scale. That means the modern map is often more comfortable than the old one with silence. It would rather be empty than speculative. A 16th century compiler, by contrast, might prefer a southern continent to an awkward admission that the lower edge of the world remained uncertain. So when we say a 500-year-old map shows something modern maps do not, we should be careful about what that means. It does not necessarily mean the old map is more geographically correct in any absolute sense. It may mean the old map still shows the scaffolding, the inheritance, the uncertainty, the multilingual contact, the coexistence of root knowledge and world theory, the visible compromise between local precision and global confusion, the social history behind a coastline. Modern maps, by contrast, are optimized products. They are better for navigation, analysis, administration, and integration into larger systems. They are not trying to preserve the drama of becoming. They are trying to serve the discipline of use. And that is perhaps the real answer hiding in this whole discussion. The Piri Reis Map feels rich not because modern maps are deficient, but because old maps were allowed to remain visibly human. They could still show where knowledge had come from, even if only indirectly. They could still preserve older worlds inside newer discoveries. They could still let theory and observation bump shoulders without filing a complaint. Modern maps are better at being dependable. They are worse, by intention, at showing the path by which dependability was won. They do not want to look unfinished. The Piri Reis Map still does, and that unfinished quality is part of its gift. So the question is not whether the old map or the modern one is superior in some grand universal sense. The question is what each is trying to make visible. The modern map shows a settled surface, flattened through chosen projection, cleaned through generalization, standardized for users, and divided into specialized products where necessary. The old map shows a world that has not yet fully stopped arguing with itself. That is why one can help you cross an ocean more safely today, while the other can still make you stop and wonder what kind of knowledge had to move through so many hands before a coastline could look that certain on a sheet of parchment in 1513. And once you begin noticing that difference, the mystery changes shape. It becomes less about hidden continents and more about interpretation itself, about the difficult territory between a genuine mistake, a real mystery, and a misunderstanding that later centuries keep repeating because it is simply too tempting to let go. There is a point in almost every historical mystery when the object itself stops being the only problem, and the people looking at it become part of the problem too. The Piri Reis Map has been living in that condition for a very long time. By now, it is not only a 16th century chart, it is also a magnet for expectation. Some people come to it hoping for confirmation that the past was more advanced than official history admits. Some come hoping to prove the opposite, that every supposed anomaly dissolves instantly under sober examination. And somewhere between those two camps sits the map itself, still doing the more complicated thing it has always done, which is to contain real skill, real uncertainty, real inherited error, and real gaps in our knowledge all at once. The difficulty is that those categories are much less tidy than most people would like. That is why this subject lives in the territory between mistake, mystery, and misunderstanding. A mistake is not hard to imagine. Old maps are full of them. Coastlines are bent, islands drift, continents merge, and mariners who know one shore intimately can still place it very poorly in relation to another. A mystery is also easy to imagine. We no longer possess all the source charts Piri Reis used, and the map itself survives only in part, so there are genuine holes in the documentary chain behind it. But misunderstanding is often the most powerful of the three because misunderstanding lets later generations force the map into arguments it was never made to settle. Once that begins, every old line becomes vulnerable to new desires. A southern land becomes Antarctica. A transitional coastline becomes proof of forgotten global surveys. A preserved confusion becomes evidence of suppression. The object has not changed. The appetite around it has. The first thing worth saying is that genuine mistakes on the Piri Reis map do not make the map trivial. In fact, they make it more historically legible. The northwestern section, especially around the Caribbean, is one of the clearest examples. Modern scholarship has long connected its odd arrangement to Colombian misunderstandings, with Cuba fused conceptually to the Asian mainland, and Hispaniola oriented in a way that reflects older assumptions rather than settled New World geography. That is not random incompetence. It is inherited error. It shows the map absorbing source material from an earlier stage of Atlantic knowledge, when new discoveries were still being interpreted through older frameworks about Asia and the Indies. Britannica's overview of the Age of Discovery notes that early 16th century maps often blended new discoveries with geographic ideas inherited from Ptolemy, and the Piri Reis map fits that pattern beautifully. It is not failing to understand the world in a simple sense. It is showing us the world while understanding is still rearranging itself. That is a crucial distinction because it changes how we treat error. A mistake in an old map is not always merely wrong in the modern classroom sense. Sometimes it is historically diagnostic. It tells you where information came from, what framework it entered, and which older ideas still had enough authority to deform what was new. If Cuba behaves oddly, that may tell us more about Colombian source material than about Piri Reis's own carelessness. If a southern land appears where later maps handle the south differently, that may tell us more about inherited Terra Australis conventions than about some secret polar survey. Error, in such a case, is not noise, it is evidence. It can reveal the age and character of a source tradition more clearly than an apparently correct line ever could. That is one of the reasons old cartography is so rewarding. Its mistakes are often annotated fossils of thought. And yet the Piri Reis map is not reducible to mistake. That would be too easy, and it would ignore the parts of the map that are plainly strong for their time. UNESCO describes the 1513 map as a distinguished Portolan-style work built from numerous earlier maps, and notes that, at a time when positioning newly discovered places was technically very difficult, Piri Reis produced a detailed and considerably accurate depiction of newly discovered coastlines and Atlantic islands. The same UNESCO materials point to the placement of the Azores, Canary Islands, and Cape Verde Islands as considerably close to their actual positions, and emphasise the map's role in transmitting the latest Spanish and Portuguese discoveries into the Ottoman world. So the map is not simply a patchwork of blunders. It contains real competence, real access to current information, and real cartographic judgment. This is where mystery properly enters. The mystery is not that the map does impossible things. The mystery is that we do not possess the full documentary ladder by which it climbed to the level it reached. Piri Reis was unusually helpful in explaining that he used multiple source maps, including Portuguese material, older world maps, and a map associated with Columbus. But we do not have all of those source objects in front of us now. The map therefore presents results without preserving every stage of its own making. That creates exactly the kind of historical gap in which mystery thrives. A coastline looks unexpectedly good, and we ask how it got there. An island group seems well handled, and we want the vanished chart behind it. A peculiar Caribbean arrangement suggests a lost Colombian source, and suddenly the surviving map feels like a witness giving testimony about documents no longer in the room. Notice, though, what kind of mystery that is. It is not the mystery of extraterrestrials, or Ice Age atlases, or hidden civilizational masterminds hovering behind history, with impeccable draftsmanship and a disappointing refusal to leave receipts. It is the mystery of incomplete archives. It is the mystery of ordinary historical loss. A working chart gets copied, then replaced, then mislaid. A navigational tradition moves through several ports and survives only indirectly in a later compilation. A map by Columbus disappears, but part of its worldview remains embedded in a chart made by an Ottoman admiral. That kind of mystery is less cinematic and more convincing. It respects both the object and the period. It allows the past to be sophisticated without requiring it to become supernatural. The trouble begins when misunderstanding takes that ordinary mystery and inflates it into something the map cannot actually support. The southern landmass at the bottom of the surviving fragment is the most famous case. Most historians interpret that feature as a version of Terra Australis, the long-imagined southern continent that appeared on many maps before Antarctica was actually charted. UNESCO explicitly places the Piri Reis Map among the early works showing Terra Australis, and general historical treatments of early modern exploration stress that maps of the period often mix new discoveries with older inherited geographic expectations. Yet in the 20th century, writers such as Arlington Mallory and Charles Hapgood argued that the southern part of the map represented an ice-free Antarctic coast, and thus preserved vastly older knowledge. That reading became culturally influential, but has not held up well. Later summaries of the scholarship note that the Antarctica claim is widely rejected, and that the map's southern line is better explained through a combination of South American material, inherited southern continent theory, and cartographic distortion. What is especially telling about the Antarctica misunderstanding is that it depends on looking past the map's own context. The inscriptions tied to the southern coast do not sound Antarctic. Modern summaries note that the text describes the region as hot and associated with large snakes, which is a fairly poor fit for a frozen polar coastline unless one is prepared to grant Antarctica a much more adventurous reptile policy than the evidence currently supports. More importantly, the Antarctica theory relies on heavily reworking the map, repositioning its points against modern grids, and judging resemblance after those transformations have already occurred. That is a dangerous habit with early maps. Shape comparison can be seductive, but if a coastline has been bent, compressed, inherited from several sources, or fitted to irregular parchment, It can be made to resemble more than one later form, depending on how aggressively one handles it. What begins as interpretation quickly becomes imposition. This is the heart of misunderstanding. It is not just getting a fact wrong, it is asking the wrong kind of question of the object. The Piri Reis Map was not made to answer whether an ancient civilization surveyed Antarctica. It was made as a 16th century world chart in a Portoland tradition, drawing together recent maritime discoveries and inherited geographic concepts for practical and intellectual use in the Ottoman world. Once you ask it to certify modern fringe claims, you are no longer reading the map historically, you are using it as a prop. That may produce excitement, but it produces very little understanding. It is like interrogating a church bell for its views on wireless communication. The problem is not with the bell, it is with the interviewer. There is another misunderstanding that goes in the opposite direction and is almost as limiting. This is the version that says, because some grand claims around the map are false, the map itself is uninteresting. That would be a pity, because it would mean allowing bad theories to steal attention from a genuinely remarkable artifact. The Piri Reis Map remains valuable even after the loudest exaggerations are set aside. It still preserves evidence of unusually broad source use within the Ottoman world. It still shows how recent Iberian discoveries were being absorbed beyond Iberia. It still contains a likely trace of now-lost Colombian cartography. It still captures early modern geography in a transitional state, where new lands were being fitted into older structures of thought. And it still lets us see a mapmaker openly discussing his methodology in ways many contemporary maps did not. That is already a remarkable bundle of qualities without any need for hidden polar civilizations. If anything, the quieter reading is more impressive, because it gives credit where credit is due. It credits mariners who accumulated practical coastal knowledge. It credits chart traditions that could be strong locally even when larger world pictures remained unstable. It credits compilers like Piri Reis, who had the skill to gather contradictory materials and make something coherent enough to endure. And it credits the broader age of discovery for being more technically and intellectually entangled than simplified popular history often admits. Britannica's account of early modern exploration emphasises that maps from the period reflected uncertainty and synthesis, rather than a smooth march from ignorance to final truth. The Piri Reis Map is one of the best surviving illustrations of exactly that process. Perhaps the most useful way to stand between mistake, mystery and misunderstanding is to ask, of any puzzling feature, 3 separate questions instead of one. First, could this be an error inherited from a source tradition? Very often the answer is yes. Second, does this feature point to a real gap in our documentation, where lost charts or missing context prevent a full explanation? Sometimes yes again. Third, are modern readers projecting later expectations onto the line and making it answer for debates alien to its own time? Quite often, yes yet again. The power of the Piri Reis Map is that all 3 modes are active at once. Some parts are mistaken, but in historically revealing ways. Some parts are genuinely puzzling because the source chain is incomplete. Some parts have been dramatically misunderstood because modern viewers are very good at forcing old objects into new narratives. And perhaps that is why the map has endured in the popular imagination while so many equally worthy historical objects remain politely obscure. It sits exactly at the point where sober scholarship and imaginative overreach can both find something to work with. It is good enough to tempt exaggeration and strange enough to resist complete domestication. It has just enough precision to challenge condescension toward the past, and just enough distortion to frustrate anyone hoping for a perfect anomaly. It is a wonderfully inconvenient object, too skillful to dismiss, too mixed to mythologize honestly, too incomplete to settle everything, and too eloquent to be ignored. The modern urge, of course, is to force a verdict. Was it right or wrong? Did it know too much or not? Was it ordinary or extraordinary? But the map is at its most instructive when we stop demanding a single category from it. Historical artifacts often resist the binary, because history itself is built out of mixtures. A source can be excellent in one region and poor in another. A compiler can be brilliant and constrained. A map can preserve real discoveries and real misconceptions side by side. A later audience can identify a genuine puzzle and then solve it badly. The Piri Reis Map is not difficult because it is uniquely chaotic. It is difficult because it is unusually honest about the layered way geographic knowledge was made. That layered honesty is what makes the distinction between mystery and misunderstanding so important. Mystery says we do not know everything because the archive is incomplete. Misunderstanding says we think we know more than we do because we have fitted the object to a story we prefer. The first is intellectually healthy. The second is intellectually comfortable. The first leaves room for careful work, for comparison with other early maps, for reading inscriptions, for tracing source traditions, for asking why some coasts are stronger than others. The second jumps straight to revelation. One produces history, the other produces a genre. There is a certain tenderness, I think, in letting the map remain in that middle space. Not because indecision is always noble, but because some objects deserve to be met at the level they actually inhabit. The Piri Reis Map is not a miracle in the lazy sense, and it is not a fraud. It is a 16th century world chart made by a highly capable Ottoman admiral and compiler, using mixed sources in a rapidly changing moment of global knowledge. It contains errors because such maps do. It contains unusually strong features because its sources and compiler were in some ways unusually good. It contains unresolved questions because not all the earlier documents behind it survived. And it has accumulated modern myths because human beings love nothing so much as an old object that appears to flatter their suspicion that the official story is incomplete. On that last point at least, they are not entirely wrong. The official story is incomplete. It is simply incomplete in the ordinary historical way, not in the theatrical one. So we arrive, at last, at a calmer understanding. The Piri Reis Map lives between mistake, mystery, and misunderstanding because it was born in a world where maps could still visibly carry all three. It inherited errors from older geographies. It preserved clues to sources now missing. And it now suffers a little from readers who want it to prove more than it can. To read it well is to resist all three temptations at once. The temptation to dismiss it because it is imperfect, the temptation to mythologize it because it is impressive, and the temptation to modernize it by asking it to behave like a document from our own conceptual world. It is better than that. Stranger than that too. It is an old map still asking us whether we know the difference between a line, an idea, and a wish. And once that difference is clear, something else becomes visible beyond all the arguments. The map is no longer just a puzzle about coastlines. It becomes a record of how human beings tried to know the world when the world was still arriving in fragments. That is why it still matters. Not because it solves history, but because it preserves the feeling of history still being assembled. And from there, the story can finally turn toward its quietest conclusion, away from the need to prove and toward the deeper question the map has been carrying all along. What it means when the world we think we know has been shaped, line by things we no longer fully remember. There is a quiet trick the Piri Reis Map plays on the modern mind, and it is not really about proving some hidden theory. It is about proportion. We look at the surviving fragment, at its Atlantic coastlines, its notes, its confidence, its inherited strangeness, and for a moment the early 16th century no longer feels as small as we have been taught to imagine. The map was drawn in 1513 in Portolan style, at a time when positioning newly discovered places was extraordinarily difficult, and yet UNESCO describes it as producing a detailed and considerably accurate depiction of coastlines and islands in the newly discovered regions, while also drawing on both Western and Eastern source traditions. That alone is enough to make the world of Piri Reis feel larger than the tidy version we carry around now. Not larger in miles, of course, larger in contact, in memory, in ambition, and in the number of hands through which knowledge had already passed before it ever settled into ink. We are very good at shrinking the past to fit our own comfort. We do it constantly. We tell ourselves that people long ago lived in little islands of ignorance, separated from one another by fear, distance, and crude instruments, until eventually modern reason arrived and pulled the curtains open. There is some truth in that story if stated carefully enough. Modern cartography is incomparably better for most practical purposes. Surveying, geodesy, hydrography, satellite imaging, standardized projection, and digital geospatial systems have changed mapping beyond recognition. But the danger is that once we become too satisfied with that account of progress, we begin flattening earlier centuries into something simpler than they were. The Piri Reis Map resists that flattening. It reminds us that the age of sail was already full of information moving between empires, pilots, merchants, prisoners, port cities, and copying traditions. Britannica notes that Portolan charts grew through repeated revisions and information gathered from pilots and captains, eventually surpassing earlier maps in accuracy and reliability. So when we look at Piri Reis, we're not seeing a lone marvel floating above his era. We're seeing what an era could produce when many streams of practical knowledge met in one capable compiler. That is why the world can seem larger on an old map than on a modern one, not because the old map knows more in the strict technical sense, but because it still shows more of the process by which people were trying to know. A modern map usually gives you the verdict. Here is the coastline, here is the border, here is the route. It is wonderfully useful and often beautifully efficient, but it rarely lets you feel the argument underneath. The Piri Reis Map still does. It allows local precision to sit beside inherited confusion. It allows current discoveries to coexist with older ideas about what the southern world ought to contain. It carries notes, symbols, and visual habits that make the chart feel less like a final product and more like a meeting place. UNESCO emphasises that the map is unusual not only for its detail but for the fact that Piri Reis discussed his sources and method, and that it was built from both Eastern and Western materials. The result is that the map does not just show land, it shows transmission. And perhaps that is what we have been circling all along. When the world was larger than we remember, it was not because people had solved geography and then somehow misplaced the paperwork. It was because the known world, the guessed world, the inherited world, and the newly encountered world all sat closer together on the same page. A harbour report could stand near an ancient assumption. A recently sailed coast could be fitted into an older mental geography. A map could preserve both a real observation and the misunderstanding attached to it. To us, that mixture can feel untidy. To the people living through it, it was simply the condition of knowledge. The world had not yet been cleaned into the categories we prefer. It had not yet been fully sorted into correct data, historical background, outdated theory, and decorative excess. It was still arriving in one piece and falling apart into many pieces at the same time. There is something almost intimate in that. An old map lets you witness human beings trying to hold more of the world in their heads than they can quite manage. Not failing exactly, but stretching. Stretching language, memory, inherited learning, practical navigation, and visual form until the thing on the parchment can carry more than any one person ever saw firsthand. We should probably admire that more than we do. It is easy to admire the finished achievement of modern mapping because it is so visibly precise. It is harder, but perhaps more rewarding, to admire the earlier achievement of assembling a world from fragments before the standards of certainty we now take for granted even existed. And fragments matter. One reason the Piri Reis Map continues to feel so alive is that it survives as a fragment itself, rediscovered in the Topkapi Palace Library in 1929 after centuries of relative obscurity. That history of disappearance and return is part of its effect. It is not only an old map, it is an old map that had to survive neglect, catalogues, changing institutions, and the simple human tendency to misplace or overlook things until a later generation learns what it has in front of it. UNESCO's record of the map stresses the 1929 rediscovery and its character as a treasured work of art and science. A fragment rediscovered centuries later is always going to feel larger than its dimensions. It carries the weight of everything around it that did not survive with equal luck. That is why the missing material matters so much. Behind the Piri Reis Map are other charts, other reports, other navigators, other workshops, other shores. Some of them left clear traces, others survive only as pressure in the line. We know, because Piri Reis said so, that he worked from multiple earlier sources, and UNESCO highlights the map's role as a synthesis of Eastern and Western knowledge streams. What we do not have is the full room of documents around him. We do not have every chart he consulted. We do not have every intermediate copy. We do not have every pilot's account that may have fed those charts. So when we stand before the surviving fragment, we are also standing before an absence. That absence does not make the map less valuable, it makes it more human. It reminds us that history survives unevenly. Sometimes a coastline remains when the voyage behind it has gone quiet. Sometimes a note survives when the speaker does not. Sometimes a compilation outlives the materials that made it possible. There is a temptation, when faced with that kind of absence, to grow theatrical, to imagine hidden repositories, suppressed truths, magnificent archives swallowed whole in a single blaze, while the wise few hurried away with the last authentic chart of some vanished coast. And to be fair, the human mind has always enjoyed a dramatic storage solution. But the reality is usually slower and stranger. Knowledge leaks away by copies, revisions, obsolescence, neglect, translation, politics, institutional change, and the very success of newer systems that make older working objects seem less necessary. Britannica's account of Portland development points toward precisely this working culture of repeated revision. A chart used hard at sea, copied often, and then replaced by better or more current material does not need a villain to disappear. It only needs time. That may be less cinematic, but it is also more haunting. A thing can vanish not because anyone wanted it gone, but because history kept moving and did not promise to keep every draft. And so the world becomes smaller in one way as it becomes larger in another. Modern maps give us astonishing reach. We can see almost anything, locate almost anything, measure almost anything. Yet in gaining that settled surface, we sometimes lose the visible sense of how knowledge once travelled. The old map preserves that journey. It remembers that the world was not always available as a finished image. It had to be assembled from winds, sightings, reports, copied names, rival claims, and practical courage. There is a dignity in that which modern convenience can accidentally hide from us. A person with a glowing screen can now cross cities without learning a single turn by heart. A pilot in the age of sail had to carry portions of the world in memory and habit and in trust. Those are different kinds of knowing. One is not morally superior to the other, but only one still leaves its uncertainty visible in the line. That may be the most beautiful thing the Piri Reis Map preserves. Not a secret continent, not a scandalous revelation, not proof that history has been hiding an impossible answer under the floorboards, but the sight of human knowledge before it was fully standardized. The chart still has edges where worlds meet awkwardly. It still shows the Atlantic as a zone of gathering information rather than a settled chapter in an atlas. It still lets inherited theories brush against fresh observation. It still carries the old confidence that a map can be useful, wrong, elegant, ambitious, and revealing all at once. UNESCO calls it a distinguished union of art and science, and that phrase feels right not because it is flattering, but because it captures the dual life of the object. It is not merely technical and not merely symbolic. It is both. It tells you where people thought the world was and how they wanted that world to appear when drawn. There is also a more personal way to think about all this. Most of us live inside maps we did not make and barely notice. We trust them because they work, and we should. But perhaps that trust has a side effect. It can make the world feel finished before we have really looked at it. Everything seems indexed, located and resolved. Every place already has its outline. Every distance already has its number. The Piri Reis Map interrupts that feeling for a moment. It reminds us that the world did not always arrive pre-arranged. There was a time when coastlines were still stories becoming measurements, when islands came into shared awareness through repeated telling, when one good chart might depend on a dozen vanished ones, and when a person standing at a desk in Gallipoli or Cairo could participate in a global act of assembly without ever believing he had completed it. That interruption is valuable. It makes us less arrogant about the present and kinder toward the past. It suggests that our ancestors were not wandering around in a fog waiting to be rescued by future accuracy. They were building systems of knowledge with the tools, assumptions and contacts available to them, and sometimes those systems were subtle enough to leave us still arguing 500 years later. The Piri Reis Map does not show that they knew everything. It shows something more credible and more impressive. It shows that they knew enough to make complexity travel, enough to gather the Atlantic into one surface, enough to preserve lost sources inside later lines, enough to make a fragment discovered in 1929 still capable of unsettling the comfortable simplifications of modern memory. And perhaps that is what it means to say the world was larger than we remember. Not that the oceans were wider or the continents less fixed, but that the act of knowing them involved more visible uncertainty, more inherited depth, more borrowed testimony, and more room for wonder without immediate closure. The old map does not flatter us with completion. It offers us company in incompletion. It says that human beings have always tried to draw a world bigger than any one of them could fully possess, and that the attempt itself leaves beautiful evidence behind. A line of coast here, an island there, a note in the margin, a source now gone, a fragment remaining. So when you think back to the Piri Reis Map now, perhaps the question is no longer whether it secretly knew what modern maps forgot. That is too narrow, and in a way too loud. A gentler question may be better. What kinds of knowledge become invisible when a world is cleaned, standardized, and made to look complete? What histories vanish when the line becomes final? What earlier acts of memory, risk and transmission are hidden once the coast settles into a calm modern outline? The old Parchment does not answer all of that. It simply keeps the questions open, and that may be enough. Enough to let the map remain what it has always been at its best. Not a proof, not a hoax, not a relic to be bullied into somebody else's grand theory, but a surviving witness to a time when the world still arrived in fragments, and people were learning, with extraordinary patience and imperfect tools, how to draw those fragments into relation. There is something very restful about that in the end. The realization that certainty did not appear all at once. That even our clearest pictures of the world rest on long chains of effort, revision, and survival. That the past was not smaller, only less settled, and that somewhere, on a piece of parchment from 1513, you can still feel the size of that unfinished world.